The snowfall outside the Carter household was a postcard-perfect scene. Thick flakes drifted down, dusting the ground in a pristine white blanket. Inside, the family had gathered in the warm glow of Christmas lights strung around the fireplace. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments from years past, each one a cherished memory. Emily, the mother, sat on the couch, her heart heavy despite the festive atmosphere. Her daughter, Chloe, now 18, was laughing with her stepfather, Mark, as they exchanged playful banter while unwrapping presents. Emily couldn't help but notice the subtle closeness between them, the way Chloe leaned into Mark's shoulder when she laughed, the way his gaze lingered on her a moment too long. A gnawing unease had been building in Emily for months, but tonight, amidst the celebration, it felt impossible to ignore. "Chloe, did you see the gift I left for you under the tree?" Emily asked, forcing a smile as she pointed to the small, wrapped box. "Oh, I'll get to it, Mom," Chloe replied absent-mindedly, her focus still on Mark. Emily's heart clenched. It wasn't just tonight. Over the past year, Chloe's behavior had shifted. The girl who once confided in her about everything had become distant, her attention increasingly drawn to Mark. At first, Emily had dismissed it as teenage rebellion, but now she wasn't so sure. Later that evening, as the family sat around the dining table for Christmas dinner, the tension was palpable. The clinking of silverware and polite exchanges did little to mask the growing unease. Emily's gaze flicked between Mark and Chloe, her thoughts swirling. "Mark, could you pass the gravy?" Emily asked, her voice strained. Mark obliged with a warm smile, but Emily noticed the way Chloe's gaze followed him, her expression softening in a way that made Emily's stomach churn. "So, Chloe," Mark said, turning his attention to her, "what are your plans for New Year's Eve? Big party with friends?" Chloe blushed slightly, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Actually, I was thinking of staying in this year. Maybe we could watch a movie." Emily's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She forced a laugh, her voice sharper than she intended. "You'd rather spend New Year's Eve at home with your stepdad than with your friends?" Chloe shrugged, her tone defensive. "I don't see the big deal. Mark and I always have fun together." Mark chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. "She's just being sweet, Emily. Nothing wrong with wanting a quiet New Year's." But Emily wasn't reassured. The words, "always have fun together," echoed in her mind, fueling the sense that something wasn't right. The evening wore on, and Emily's unease deepened. After dinner, as Chloe and Mark settled on the couch to watch a movie, Emily retreated to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she washed the dishes. She stared out the window at the snow-covered yard, her mind racing. Was she overreacting? Was this just the result of her own insecurities? Or was there something more to Chloe and Mark's closeness? Unable to shake the feeling, Emily decided to confront Chloe. She found her daughter in her room later that night, scrolling through her phone. "Chloe, can we talk?" Emily asked, closing the door behind her. Chloe glanced up, her expression wary. "What's up?" Emily hesitated, unsure of how to phrase her concerns without sounding paranoid. "I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Mark lately. And tonight at dinner. It felt like there was something off." Chloe frowned, setting her phone aside. "What do you mean, off?" "I mean the way you look at him," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The way he looks at you. It's unusual." Chloe's eyes widened, a flash of guilt crossing her face before she masked it with indignation. "You're imagining things, Mom. Mark and I are just close because you're always busy. He actually listens to me." Emily's heart sank at the accusation. "Chloe, I've always been here for you. If you feel like I haven't been, I'm sorry. But this, whatever this is, it's not normal." Chloe crossed her arms, her tone icy. "Maybe if you weren't so controlling, Mark and I wouldn't have to tiptoe around you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Tiptoe? What are you talking about?" Chloe stood, her voice rising. "You're always watching us, always judging. Mark's the only one who makes me feel like I matter. He treats me like an adult, not some stupid kid." Emily stared at her daughter, the words cutting deeper than she'd expected. Chloe, he's your stepfather. There are boundaries. Maybe you're just jealous because he pays more attention to me than he does to you, Chloe snapped. The accusation hit Emily like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. Chloe stormed past her, slamming the door as she left. Emily spent the rest of the night pacing the living room, tears streaming down her face. The holiday lights twinkled mockingly, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in her family. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was deeply wrong, and she needed to confront it before it tore them apart. As the clock struck midnight, marking the end of Christmas Day, Emily made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, no matter how painful, and fight for her family. But deep down, she couldn't shake the fear that the damage might already be irreparable. The morning after the shocking revelation, the Carter household was an entirely different place. The once familiar home, filled with shared memories and light-hearted conversations, now echoed with the weight of unspoken words. James, still reeling from the night before, locked himself in his room, unwilling to face the chaos he'd inadvertently unleashed. Margaret, her composure fractured, retreated to the solace of her garden, a space she often turned to when life felt unmanageable. Emily and David sat in the living room, their expressions etched with disbelief. David held a mug of coffee, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. Emily's eyes were fixed on the photo frames that adorned the mantel, each one a snapshot of happier times. But now, every image felt like a cruel reminder of the family they once were, and the one they no longer were. "How did we not see it?" Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "How did this happen right under our noses?" David shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought. I never even imagined something like this." "It's sick," Emily said, her voice rising. "It's wrong. We trusted her. She's my mother, for God's sake. And James, he's just a kid. What has she done to him?" David placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "We don't know the full story yet," he said. "We need to talk to them to understand what's really going on." Emily scoffed, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Understand? What is there to understand, David?" She crossed a line that no one should ever cross. "There's nothing to explain." Meanwhile, in the sanctuary of her garden, Margaret struggled to find peace. The soft hum of bees and the gentle rustling of leaves did little to soothe her frayed nerves. She couldn't shake the memory of Emily's horrified expression, the venom in her daughter's voice. She had always been proud of her bond with her family, but now that bond felt irreparably broken. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see James approaching. His shoulders slumped and his face clouded with guilt. "Grandma," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Are you okay?" Margaret forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I should be asking you that," she replied. "You've been through so much." James sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know," she said gently. "But we can't undo what's been done. We can only move forward." James looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. "But how? How do we fix this?" Margaret sighed, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we have to try. For the family." Inside the house, Emily couldn't contain her frustration any longer. She stormed out to the garden, her eyes blazing as she confronted Margaret and James. "We need to talk," Emily said, her tone cold and unyielding. Margaret stood, her hands trembling. "Emily, please." "No," Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "No more excuses, no more lies. I want the truth. Right here, right now." James stood as well, his fists clenched at his sides. "Mom, you don't understand." "You're damn right I don't understand," Emily snapped. "What I understand is that my son and my mother have been hiding something from me, and I want to know what it is." Margaret tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The weight of the accusations, the fury in Emily's voice. It was too much. She looked to James for support, but he seemed just as lost as she was. David appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Emily, let's calm down," he said. "We're not going to solve anything by yelling." "Calm down," Emily repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. "You want me to calm down after what we just found out? Are you serious?" David stepped forward, placing a hand on her arm. "I know you're upset," he said gently. "But we need to handle this carefully. For Chloe's sake, if nothing else." At the mention of her daughter, Emily faltered. She looked at James, her anger momentarily giving way to sadness. "How could you do this to us?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How could you betray our trust like this?" James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Emily, I know I've let you down," she said. "And I know nothing I say can make up for what's happened. But please, don't let this destroy our family." Emily stared at her mother, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make Margaret feel the depth of her betrayal. But deep down, she knew that anger wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't erase what had happened or heal the wounds that had been inflicted. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily said finally, her voice trembling. "But for Chloe, for David, I'll try." Margaret nodded, her relief tempered by the knowledge that the road ahead would be long and difficult. "That's all I ask," she said softly. "That's all I can ask." As the family retreated back into the house, the tension lingered, a heavy presence that refused to dissipate. Margaret and James knew they had been given a chance, a fragile, tentative chance to make things right. But whether they could seize that chance and rebuild the trust they had lost remained uncertain. The shadows of suspicion still loomed, and the path to redemption was far from clear. The days following Emily's confrontation were marked by a tense silence that engulfed the Carter household. The usual warmth and laughter that once defined their family had been replaced by avoidance and unease. Margaret and James, still reeling from Emily's accusations, struggled to navigate the shifting dynamics. Emily, on the other hand, remained guarded, her mind consumed by unanswered questions and unresolved anger. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen one morning, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just days ago. She glanced at the empty chair where James usually sat, the absence of his presence cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Emily walked in, her expression unreadable as she set her bag on the counter. "Mom," Emily said curtly, her tone devoid of warmth. "We need to talk." Margaret's heart sank, but she nodded. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "Sit down." Emily hesitated before taking a seat, her gaze fixed on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking," Emily began, her voice steady but strained, "about everything, about you and James. And I still don't understand how we got here." Margaret swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of her coffee cup. "Emily, No," Emily interrupted, her gaze snapping up to meet her mother's. "I don't want excuses, Mom. I want the truth. All of it." Margaret felt the weight of Emily's words pressing down on her, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Emily, I've told you everything I can. I know it doesn't make sense to you, but there's nothing more to tell." Emily's eyes narrowed, her frustration evident. "Then why do I feel like you're still hiding something? Why do I feel like there's more to this than you're letting on?" Meanwhile, James found himself retreating further into isolation. He spent most of his time in his room, the walls closing in on him as the weight of the situation grew heavier. He couldn't shake the memory of Emily's accusations, the anger in her voice, and the disappointment in her eyes. One afternoon, unable to bear the silence any longer, James decided to visit the park. He sat on a bench near the lake, watching as families played and laughed in the distance. It was a stark reminder of what he had lost, of the family that now seemed beyond repair. His solitude was interrupted by the sound of someone calling his name. He turned to see Chloe approaching, her expression hesitant but determined. "Hey," Chloe said softly as she sat down beside him. "I've been looking for you." James offered her a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What's up?" Chloe hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I wanted to talk. About everything." James's smile faded and he looked away. "What's there to talk about?" he muttered. "Mom hates me, Grandma's falling apart, and this family is a mess." Chloe placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "James, I don't hate you. And I don't think Mom does either. She's just angry. Confused. We all are." James sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said. "I was just trying to help Grandma. To be there for her." "I know," Chloe said. "But maybe you two got too close. Maybe that's what Mom sees, and that's why she's so upset." James frowned, his jaw tightening. "It's not like that," he said firmly. "Grandma and we're just trying to cope. To get through this together." Chloe nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. "I believe you," she said. "But you need to make Mom believe you too." Back at the house, Margaret and Emily's conversation had taken a more emotional turn. Margaret's composure had begun to crack, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. "Emily, I know I've made mistakes," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I've let you down. But everything I've done because I love this family. Because I love you." Emily's own eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "Love isn't enough, Mom," she said softly. "Not when it's built on lies." Margaret reached across the table, taking Emily's hands in her own. "I'm not lying to you, Emily," she said. "I'm telling you the truth. Please believe me." Emily hesitated, her emotions warring within her. She wanted to believe her mother, to trust her, but the doubts lingering in her mind wouldn't let her. "I need time," Emily said finally, pulling her hands away. "I need time to figure out what I believe. To figure out if I can trust you again." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I'll be here when you're ready." The cracks in the Carter family's facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret and James were trying desperately to hold on, but the strain of suspicion and mistrust was taking its toll. Emily, torn between anger and love, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her family. As the sun set on another tense day, Margaret stood in the garden, staring at the fading light. She made a silent vow to herself, to fight for her family, to prove her love and rebuild their trust. But deep down, she couldn't shake the fear that it might already be too late. The Carter family home, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt like a labyrinth of silence and unspoken tension. Margaret found herself drifting through the days, her routines mechanical and void of joy. She clung to the small moments that still brought her comfort: James's presence, a fleeting smile, or the quiet hours spent in her garden. Margaret sat on the porch that afternoon, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The late summer air carried the faint scent of lavender, but it did little to soothe her restlessness. James approached, his steps hesitant as he carried 2 glasses of iced tea. He set one on the small table beside her before taking a seat. "You've been quiet," James said, his voice gentle. Margaret sighed, her hands gripping the glass. "I've been thinking about us, about the family. It's all so broken." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It doesn't have to stay that way," he said. "We can fix it." Margaret gave him a weak smile. "You're always so hopeful." "Someone has to be," James replied, his tone soft but determined. Meanwhile, Emily was at home, pacing the living room while David watched her warily from the couch. She had spent the day replaying her last conversation with Margaret, dissecting every word and tone for hidden meaning. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," David said, his attempt at humor falling flat. Emily ignored him, her mind racing. "Something still doesn't add up," she muttered. "Mom's hiding something, I know it." David sighed, setting his book aside. "Emily, we've been through this. Maybe you're overthinking it." "I'm not overthinking," Emily snapped. "I'm trying to protect our family." David frowned. "And what if you're wrong? What if all you're doing is pushing them further away?" Emily froze, his words striking a nerve. She sank onto the couch beside him, her shoulders slumping. "What if I'm not wrong?" she whispered. "What if there's more to this than we realize?" The family's fracture became even more apparent during a chance meeting at the local grocery store. Margaret and James were shopping together, their conversation light and easy as they moved through the aisles. Emily, who had stopped by to pick up a few items, spotted them near the produce section. She watched from a distance, her heart sinking as she observed their interactions. There was nothing overtly suspicious, but the familiarity between them. James's hand briefly brushing Margaret's arm, the way they laughed at some private joke, only deepened her unease. Unable to stay silent, Emily approached them. "James," she said, her tone sharp. Margaret stiffened, her smile fading as she turned to face her daughter. "Emily," she said, her voice tight. "What a surprise. Is it?" Emily asked, her gaze narrowing. "You two seem to be spending a lot of time together." James stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "Grandma needs help, and I'm here for her," he said evenly. "What's the problem with that?" Emily crossed her arms, her eyes flicking between them. "The problem is that it feels like you're shutting the rest of us out. Like you're hiding something." "Emily, that's enough," Margaret said firmly, her voice trembling. "We're not hiding anything." "Then why does it feel like you are?" Emily shot back. The confrontation ended abruptly, with Margaret and James leaving the store in silence. As they drove home, Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "She doesn't trust us," Margaret said, her voice heavy with sadness. James stared out the window, his expression stormy. "She's never going to trust us, no matter what we say or do." Margaret glanced at him, her heart aching. "Then we'll just have to keep trying," she said softly. "Because giving up isn't an option." The fractured reflection of their family dynamic continued to weigh on them all, each member grappling with their own doubts and fears. Margaret and James clung to each other for strength, but the cracks in their relationship with Emily and David seemed impossible to mend. The question of whether their family could ever be whole again loomed over them, unanswered. The atmosphere in the Carter household had become suffocating, each member retreating further into their corners of doubt and mistrust. The small moments of normalcy, shared meals, polite conversations, had become a facade barely holding the family together. Emily's suspicions had reached a boiling point, and Margaret and James felt like they were navigating a minefield with every interaction. It was late afternoon when Emily decided she couldn't keep her thoughts to herself any longer. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the calendar on the fridge. Each passing day felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion, and she couldn't bear the weight of her doubts any longer. With a deep breath, she called David into the room. "David," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." David entered, a tired look on his face. "What's on your mind?" "It's about Mom and James," Emily said, her words rushing out like a dam breaking. "I can't shake the feeling that something's going on between them. Something more than they're admitting." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily, we've been over this. They're grieving. They've both been through a lot." Emily shook her head, her frustration bubbling over. "This isn't just about grief, David. It's the way they act around each other, the way they look at each other. It's not normal." David crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And what do you want to do about it?" "Accuse them of something without proof. Drive an even bigger wedge into the family." Emily's voice rose, her anger spilling out. "What am I supposed to do? Pretend I don't see what's right in front of me? Let them keep lying to us?" David placed a hand on her shoulder, his tone soft but firm. "Emily, I know you're trying to protect this family. But sometimes, the best way to protect something is to let it heal on its own." Emily pulled away, her frustration evident. "And what if it doesn't? What if this family is already broken beyond repair?" Meanwhile, Margaret and James were in the living room, attempting to enjoy a quiet evening. Margaret sat on the couch with a book in her lap, though her eyes rarely moved across the page. James was sprawled out in the armchair, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. The tension between them was unspoken but palpable. "Grandma," James said finally, breaking the silence, "do you ever think about leaving? Just getting away from all of this?" Margaret looked up, startled by the question. "Leaving? What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we just moved somewhere else?" James said, his voice low. "Started over. Away from all the judgment and the accusations." Margaret's heart ached at his words. "James, running away won't fix anything. It'll only make things worse." James sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I just don't know how much more of this I can take." Margaret set her book aside, leaning forward to place a comforting hand on his knee. "I know it's hard," she said softly. "But we have to stay strong. For the family. For ourselves." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Emily's footsteps approaching. She entered the room, her expression tense and determined. "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Margaret and James exchanged a wary glance before nodding. Emily sat down across from them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I can't keep pretending like everything's fine," Emily began, her voice trembling. "I need to know the truth. About you two." Margaret's stomach twisted, but she kept her composure. "Emily, we've told you everything. There's nothing more to say." "Don't lie to me," Emily snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "I see the way you act around each other. The way you look at each other. It's not normal." James clenched his fists, his voice rising in frustration. "Mom, we're not doing anything wrong. Why can't you just believe us?" "Because it doesn't add up." Emily shot back. "None of this adds up. And until you can give me a real explanation, I can't trust either of you." Margaret reached out, her voice trembling. "Emily, please. We're trying to make things right. We're trying to hold this family together." Emily stood, her body tense with emotion. "Then prove it," she said, her voice cold. "Because right now, all I see are lies and betrayal." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Margaret and James sitting in stunned silence. That night, Margaret lay awake in bed, her mind racing. She replayed Emily's words over and over, each one cutting deeper than the last. She knew Emily had every right to be angry, but the weight of her accusations felt unbearable. In the room next door, James sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His chest felt tight, his thoughts a whirlwind of guilt and frustration. He wanted to protect his grandmother, to shield her from the pain that Emily's accusations were causing. But he didn't know how. As the clock ticked past midnight, Margaret made a silent vow. She would find a way to prove her love for her family, to rebuild the trust they had lost. But deep down, she feared that it might already be too late. The warmth of sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees lining the driveway as James stepped out of the car, carrying a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His mother, Emily, stood beside him, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering unease. After weeks of convincing, she had finally agreed to let James stay with his grandmother, Margaret, for the summer. It was supposed to be a chance for him to help her around the house, offer her company, and bond with a family member still grieving the loss of her husband, Robert. Margaret greeted them at the door, her arms open wide and her face lighting up with a warm smile. "James, it's so good to see you," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace. James returned the hug, feeling a surprising sense of comfort. Margaret had always been a pillar of strength, someone who radiated kindness and wisdom. But today, there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes that tugged at his heart. "Thanks for having me, Grandma," James said, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender and baked goods, a testament to Margaret's love for making her home inviting. "Of course," Margaret said, her smile unwavering. "I'm just glad to have someone here. The house gets awfully quiet these days." Emily lingered at the doorway, her gaze flickering between her son and her mother. "If you need anything, just call," she said, her tone slightly hesitant. Margaret nodded, assuring her that everything would be fine. With a final wave, Emily left, and James and Margaret were alone in the large, familiar house. The first few days passed uneventfully. James spent his mornings mowing the lawn, fixing small things around the house, and helping Margaret organize the attic. They shared meals together, talking about memories of Robert and the stories Margaret loved to recount from her younger days. The bond between them began to grow naturally, rooted in shared grief and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, Margaret opened up in a way James hadn't expected. "Losing your grandfather was the hardest thing I've ever been through," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "He was my rock, my partner in everything. And now it's just me." James looked at her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her words. "I can't imagine how hard that must be," he said sincerely. "But you're not alone, Grandma. I'm here for you." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're a good boy, James. You remind me so much of him." The conversation left a mark on both of them. For Margaret, it was a moment of connection that filled a void she hadn't realized was so deep. For James, it was the beginning of a sense of responsibility and protectiveness toward his grandmother that would grow stronger in the days to come. As the summer weeks passed, their bond deepened. They fell into an easy rhythm of shared routines and quiet companionship. Margaret began to rely on James for more than just physical tasks. She sought his opinion on household decisions, confided in him about her struggles, and found comfort in his presence. James, in turn, found himself drawn to his grandmother's resilience and warmth. He admired her strength in the face of loss and her ability to find joy in small things. Their late-night conversations over cups of tea became a cherished ritual, moments where the world outside faded away, and it was just the two of them sharing thoughts and feelings they couldn't voice to anyone else. But as their connection grew stronger, so did the subtle shifts in their relationship. What began as an innocent bond of mutual support began to blur the lines of familial roles. James noticed how Margaret's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than expected, how her touch on his shoulder felt more deliberate. He dismissed these thoughts, chalking them up to his own overactive imagination. After all, this was his grandmother, someone he loved and respected deeply. It wasn't until a quiet afternoon in the living room that James realized how much their dynamic had changed. They were sitting side by side on the couch, flipping through an old photo album Margaret had pulled out. She pointed out pictures of Robert as a young man, sharing stories that made James laugh and feel a deep connection to a grandfather he hadn't fully appreciated before. As Margaret turned the page, her hand brushed against James's. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through him. He glanced at her, noticing the slight flush on her cheeks and the way she quickly pulled her hand back. "Sorry," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," James said quickly, his own face feeling warm. The moment passed, but it lingered in James's mind long after the album was closed and Margaret had gone to bed. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension neither of them acknowledged. James found himself hyper-aware of Margaret's presence, how she moved through the house, the way her laughter filled the room, the subtle warmth of her smile. Margaret, too, seemed to struggle with the shifting dynamics between them. She found herself looking forward to James's company more than she should, her heart lifting at the sound of his voice or the sight of him entering the room. They both knew something was changing, but neither wanted to confront it. The bond they had formed was a lifeline for both of them, a way to cope with their pain and find solace in each other. But it was also becoming something neither of them fully understood, something that blurred the boundaries they had once taken for granted. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching a summer storm roll in, James finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "Grandma," he began hesitantly, "do you ever feel like things have changed between us?" Margaret turned to him, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" James hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know. It just feels like we're not the same as we used to be." Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his. "Change isn't always a bad thing, James," she said gently. "Sometimes it means we're growing closer." James nodded, though her words didn't ease the turmoil in his mind. As the storm broke and rain began to fall, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the bond that had brought them together, and the line it had crossed. The days following the initial revelation were tense. Margaret and James found themselves retreating further into their shared world, a bubble of solace where the judgment and misunderstandings from the outside couldn't reach them. But within that bubble, their connection only grew stronger, blurring the lines of what was considered appropriate. One quiet afternoon, Margaret stood in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie she intended to bake. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the countertop. James entered the room, his footsteps soft but deliberate. "Grandma," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "do you need any help?" Margaret glanced at him and smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, something she hadn't done often since Robert's passing. "I wouldn't say no to a little company," she replied. James stepped forward, pulling a chair closer to the counter. He picked up an apple and began peeling it with clumsy, uneven strokes. Margaret chuckled, her laughter light and genuine. "You're not much of a cook, are you?" she teased. James grinned, shrugging. "Guess I've got a lot to learn." As they worked side by side, the conversation drifted from mundane topics to deeper reflections. Margaret spoke about her memories of Robert, their shared dreams, their struggles, and the life they had built together. James listened intently, his gaze steady and understanding. "You know," Margaret said softly, pausing in her peeling, "when your grandfather passed, I felt like I lost a part of myself. He was my anchor, my everything." James reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers. "You still have a lot to offer, Grandma," he said. "And you're not alone. You've got me." Margaret looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, James," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." Their bond deepened further during a rainy afternoon when the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of a few candles Margaret had lit. She and James sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories to pass the time. James told her about his struggles at school, his insecurities, and his dreams of traveling the world. Margaret, in turn, opened up about her own fears and regrets. It was a level of vulnerability neither of them had expected, but it created an unspoken understanding between them. "You know," Margaret said, her voice soft, "you remind me so much of Robert when he was your age. He was kind, thoughtful, and always saw the good in people." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a big compliment," he said. "I'll do my best to live up to it." "You already have," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. The next morning, as the storm cleared, Margaret and James decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. They strolled side by side, their steps unhurried, as they talked about everything and nothing. At one point, Margaret stopped to admire a blooming rose bush in a neighbor's yard. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. James nodded, but his gaze was fixed on her. "It is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret turned to him, her expression puzzled. "James." "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "I was just thinking about how much I appreciate spending time with you." Margaret smiled, her heart warming at his words. "I feel the same way," she said. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her relationship with James had become something unique, something she couldn't quite define. It wasn't just the shared grief or the comfort they found in each other's company. It was deeper than that, more profound. And while a part of her knew they were treading dangerous ground, another part couldn't bring herself to pull away. The days in Margaret's house began to blend together as summer deepened. The routines Margaret and James had built provided a sense of stability, yet beneath the surface, both were aware of an unspoken shift. Their once clear roles as grandmother and grandson were beginning to blur in ways neither of them fully understood, or dared to acknowledge. It was during one of their routine morning walks that the turning point began to emerge. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the scent of rain that had fallen the night before. Margaret and James strolled through the park near her house, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. Margaret gestured toward a bench near a pond, the surface of the water shimmering under the gray sky. "Let's sit for a bit," she suggested. James nodded, following her lead. They settled onto the bench, the silence between them companionable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Margaret clasped her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ripples in the pond as a family of ducks swam past. "James," she said softly, breaking the quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about us. About how much we've leaned on each other these past few weeks." James turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Is that a bad thing?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "No, it's not. I'm grateful for you, for everything you've done for me. But sometimes I worry that we're becoming too dependent on each other." James's expression darkened, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. "Are you saying you don't want me here anymore?" "No," Margaret said quickly, her voice trembling. "That's not what I mean at all. I love having you here. But I don't want our bond to hurt you, or anyone else." James frowned, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. "Why would it hurt anyone? We're just spending time together. There's nothing wrong with that." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I know that. But other people might not understand. And I don't want to put you in a position where you feel judged or misunderstood." James sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't care what other people think," he said quietly. "You're the only person who really gets me, Grandma. The only one who listens." Margaret's heart ached at his words. She placed a hand under his chin, gently tilting his face toward hers. "You mean so much to me, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." That evening, Margaret and James returned to the house after their walk. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen preparing dinner, while James sat at the dining table, watching her. There was something different about the way he looked at her, something that made Margaret's pulse quicken. "Do you need any help?" James asked, his voice softer than usual. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, smiling faintly. "I've got it under control. But you can set the table if you'd like." James stood, his movements deliberate as he gathered plates and silverware. As he worked, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was heavier than it had been before, as if the air between them was charged with an unspoken energy. When they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, their laughter filling the room. But as the evening wore on, the unspoken tension returned, wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. After dinner, they retreated to the living room, where Margaret poured them each a glass of wine. "To us," James said, raising his glass with a small smile. Margaret hesitated for a moment before clinking her glass against his. "To us," she echoed. The wine loosened their inhibitions, and their conversation turned more personal. James opened up about his struggles with feeling invisible in his own family, how his parents often seemed more focused on Chloe and their own lives than on him. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just there," James admitted, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in his glass. "Like I don't really matter to anyone." Margaret's heart broke at his words. She reached out, placing a hand on his. "You matter to me, James. More than you know." James looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Grandma," he said softly. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and she quickly pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing. "You'll never have to find out," she said, her voice wavering. Later that night, as Margaret lay in bed, her thoughts raced. She replayed the evening's events in her mind, her heart pounding as she recalled the way James had looked at her, the warmth in his touch, the intensity in his words. She knew they were walking a dangerous line, one that could have devastating consequences if crossed. But despite her fear, there was a part of her, a small, selfish part, that didn't want to let go of the connection they had built. It was a lifeline in the midst of her grief, a source of comfort and joy she hadn't felt in years. And for now, she wasn't ready to give it up. In his own room, James stared at the ceiling, his thoughts equally turbulent. He couldn't deny the feelings stirring within him, feelings he knew were wrong but couldn't seem to control. He told himself it was just the result of their shared grief, the closeness they had developed out of necessity. But deep down he knew it was more than that. The turning point had been reached, and both Margaret and James were acutely aware of it. The question now was whether they would confront it, or continue to let it pull them into uncharted territory. The group stood at the threshold of the cavern's entrance, their silhouettes framed against the dying light of the setting sun. The world behind them felt distant now, its boundaries blurred by the journey that had brought them here. The lines between what they thought they knew and the reality they were uncovering had begun to dissolve. Tessa adjusted the straps of her pack and unfolded the map. The paper, worn and smudged from countless hands, felt like a relic from another lifetime. Her eyes scanned the intricate lines and symbols, trying to make sense of the path that had brought them to this moment. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, tracing a finger over a series of interlocking circles near the map's edge. "The map says we're here, but there's no mention of what comes next." Carter, ever the skeptic, leaned over her shoulder. "Maybe whoever drew the map didn't want us to know," he suggested. His tone was light, but there was an edge to his words. "Or maybe they didn't live long enough to find out." Mia shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. The air was colder here, and not just because of the altitude. There was a weight to the atmosphere, a sense of something ancient and unyielding pressing down on them. "I think we're supposed to figure it out," she said, her voice softer than usual. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the artifact they had discovered 2 days earlier. Its surface was smooth and cool, etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. It had been dormant for most of the journey, but now, as they neared the cavern, it began to hum faintly. The sound was barely audible, more a vibration than a noise, but it resonated through the group like a shared heartbeat. It was as if the artifact were alive, sensing their presence and responding to it. "Does that thing ever stop doing that?" Carter asked, eyeing the artifact warily. He had been uneasy about it from the start, and his discomfort had only grown as they got closer to their destination. "No," Mia replied, turning the artifact over in her hands. The symbols glowed faintly, casting soft patterns of light onto her face. "And it's getting stronger. I think it knows we're close." Tessa glanced up from the map, her brow furrowed. "It's not alive, Mia. Just a tool. Key maybe. We're the ones who are going to figure this out." "But what if it is alive?" Mia countered, her voice tinged with both curiosity and fear. "What if it's not just a tool but something more?" Carter snorted. "Great. Now we're babysitting a sentient rock." "It's not a rock," Mia shot back, her eyes flashing. It's enough," Tessa interrupted, her voice sharp. "Arguing isn't going to get us anywhere. Let's just focus on the task at hand." The tension between them hung in the air for a moment before Carter sighed and took a step back. "Fine. But if that thing starts talking, I'm out." Mia rolled her eyes but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the artifact, running her fingers over its surface as if trying to decipher its secrets. The humming grew slightly louder, and for a moment, she thought she could feel a pulse beneath her fingertips. The group moved forward, stepping into the cavern. The darkness swallowed them whole, the faint glow of their lanterns barely enough to pierce the shadows. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air thick with a scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp like ozone after a lightning strike. As they ventured deeper, The boundaries between reality and imagination began to blur. Shapes moved in the corners of their vision, fleeting and insubstantial. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, forming patterns that defied logic. "Do you see that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "See what?" Tessa asked, glancing back at her. Mia hesitated, her eyes scanning the shadows. "I thought I saw." "Never mind. It's probably nothing." Carter chuckled nervously. "Or it's probably something. This place isn't exactly screaming welcome." The humming of the artifact grew louder, its vibrations resonating through the cavern. The group paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "Why is it doing that?" Tessa asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Mia admitted, holding the artifact up to examine it more closely. The symbols on its surface were shifting again, forming new patterns that seemed to pulse in time with the humming. "It's never done this before." The artifact's glow illuminated the cavern walls, revealing faint etchings that had been invisible in the darkness. The symbols were similar to those on the artifact, their meanings just as elusive. Tessa stepped closer, running her fingers over the carvings. "These look ancient," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Older than anything we've seen so far." "They match the artifact," Mia pointed out. Do you think it's trying to communicate with us?" Carter scoffed. "Communicate? With what? Rocks don't talk." Tessa ignored him, focusing on the carvings. "Maybe it's not about talking. Maybe it's about unlocking something." Mia nodded, her fingers tightening around the artifact. "What if the artifact is a guide? What if it's showing us the way?" The humming grew louder still, and the glow from the artifact intensified. The carvings on the walls seemed to come alive, shifting and changing in response to the light. The boundaries between the physical and the intangible blurred further, leaving the group disoriented. "I don't like this," Carter muttered, taking a step back. "This place is wrong." "It's not wrong," Tessa said, her voice firm. "It's just different. We're on the edge of something incredible. We just have to keep going." The cavern trembled slightly, a low rumble vibrating through the ground. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. "What was that?" Mia whispered, her heart pounding. "Probably just the earth settling," Tessa said, though the doubt in her voice was clear. She glanced at the artifact in Mia's hands. "But we should keep moving. Whatever's happening, we need to find out why." The group pressed on, the cavern stretching out before them like a labyrinth of stone and shadow. The artifact's glow lit their path, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The air grew colder, the sense of something watching them intensifying. As they reached a fork in the path, Tessa consulted the map again. The symbols on the page seemed to shift and change, much like the ones on the artifact and the walls. The boundaries of what was real and what wasn't had become impossible to discern. "We go left," she decided, folding the map and tucking it into her pack. "Are you sure?" Carter asked, his skepticism evident. "No," Tessa admitted. "But it's the only way that feels right." They turned left, the path narrowing as the walls closed in around them. The artifact's humming grew louder, its glow brighter. The symbols on its surface shifted faster, their patterns becoming more complex. The boundaries between the known and the unknown had disappeared entirely. The group was no longer just exploring a cavern, they were stepping into the unknown, into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. And as they ventured deeper, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows deepened, casting jagged silhouettes of the cliffs onto the valley floor. The group moved cautiously toward the cavern's entrance, their breaths visible in the chilling air. The map in Tessa's hands trembled slightly, though whether it was from her nervousness or the growing wind, she couldn't say. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The map ends here. Whatever we're looking for, it's inside." Carter adjusted the strap of his pack, his face pale in the dim light. "And you're sure about this? Because if this is another dead end..." "It's not," Tessa snapped, cutting him off. She glared at him, though her eyes betrayed her own uncertainty. We've come too far to turn back now. Mia stepped closer, clutching the satchel containing the artifact they had unearthed earlier that day. Its presence felt heavier now, as though it were aware of what awaited them. It's reacting, she said softly, her fingers brushing against the smooth, humming surface of the object. I think we're close. The cavern loomed ahead, its gaping mouth a void of impenetrable darkness. As they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of minerals. Each step echoed unnaturally, as if the cavern were amplifying their presence, announcing their intrusion to whatever lay within. I don't like this, Carter muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on his flashlight, which flickered slightly. Feels like we're walking into a trap. Maybe we are, Tessa replied, her voice steadier now. She held up the compass, its needle spinning erratically before finally settling on a direction deeper into the cavern. But we don't have a choice. The narrow passage forced them into single file, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the jagged walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water. Every sound felt amplified. Mia's uneven breathing, the scuff of Carter's boots on loose gravel, the faint hum of the artifact. Then came the first sound, distinct and alien, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. It vibrated through their bones, resonating with something primal inside them. What was that? Mia froze, her eyes wide. She clutched the satchel tighter, her pulse quickening. Probably just the wind, Tessa said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. The compass in her hand vibrated faintly, the needle spinning again. Carter shook his head. Wind doesn't sound like that. Another sound followed, closer this time, a scraping like claws raking across stone. The group halted, exchanging uneasy glances. Keep moving, Tessa urged, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. We're almost there. The path ahead widened into a cavernous chamber, its walls glittering faintly with veins of some unknown mineral. Stalactites hung like the teeth of some massive beast, and the ground beneath their feet felt unervingly soft, almost spongy. The air grew colder. Frost clung to the walls, and their breaths formed small clouds in front of them. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound filled the space, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. I don't think we're alone, Carter whispered, his flashlight beam darting across the chamber. It landed on something at the far end, a massive, jagged altar carved from the same mineral that lined the walls. The altar pulsated with a faint, eerie glow. As they approached, the artifact in Mia's satchel began to hum louder, its vibrations almost unbearable. She winced, pulling it out to inspect it. The object's surface now shimmered with shifting patterns of light, as though it were alive. The moment the artifact was fully exposed, the cavern reacted. The faint glow from the altar intensified, illuminating the entire chamber in a ghostly light. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar. Then it appeared. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything they had ever seen. Its massive form filled the chamber, a nightmare of claws, teeth, and writhing appendages. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with an unnatural light, locking onto the group with a predatory focus. Run! Tessa screamed, shoving Carter forward as the creature lunged. Chaos erupted. The group scattered, their lanterns swinging wildly and casting frantic shadows across the walls. The creature roared again, its voice a guttural, bone-shaking sound that reverberated through the cavern. Mia clutched the artifact, her mind racing. The creature seemed to be drawn to it, its glowing eyes fixed on the object in her hands. She stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding a swipe from one of its massive claws. Tessa, she cried, her voice barely audible over the chaos. It's the artifact. It's reacting to it. Tessa didn't respond. She was frantically searching for an escape route, the compass in her hand spinning wildly. Over here, she shouted, spotting a narrow tunnel at the far end of the chamber. This way. Carter hesitated, his flashlight beam flickering as he turned toward the tunnel. The creature's tail, or was it a tentacle, lashed out, narrowly missing him and smashing into the ground with enough force to send rocks and debris flying. "Go!" Tessa yelled, grabbing Mia by the arm and pulling her toward the tunnel. The artifact in Mia's hands pulsed violently, its light growing brighter with each passing second. As they ran, the ground beneath them trembled. Rocks fell from above, and the cavern seemed to groan as though it were alive. The creature roared again, its massive form crashing through the chamber as it pursued them. "Faster!" Carter shouted, his voice tinged with panic. He glanced back, his eyes widening as the creature closed the distance. "It's gaining on us." They reached the tunnel just as another roar echoed through the cavern, followed by the sound of collapsing rock. The creature's claws scraped against the walls of the chamber, its massive bulk too large to fit through the narrow passage. For a moment the group paused, their breaths ragged as they stared back at the creature. It growled, its glowing eyes locked onto Mia and the artifact in her hands. "It's not going to stop," Mia said, her voice trembling. She looked down at the artifact, its surface now burning hot to the touch. "It wants this." "Then we keep moving," Tessa said firmly. She tightened her grip on the compass, her jaw set. "We have to find a way out." The tunnel stretched ahead, its walls closing in around them. The faint glow from the artifact was their only source of light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift. The sound of the creature's roars grew fainter, but the ground beneath them continued to tremble. "What if there is no way out?" Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at Mia, his expression a mixture of fear and desperation. "What if we're trapped?" "We're not trapped," Tessa snapped, though her own fear was evident. She pressed forward, her steps quick and determined. "There's always a way out." As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the artifact's hum grew louder, its light pulsating in sync with the distant thumping sound. The walls around them seemed to shimmer, as though responding to the artifact's energy. "What is this thing?" Mia murmured, her fingers brushing against the artifact's surface. "Why is it doing this?" No one had an answer. Ahead, the tunnel widened into another chamber, its walls covered in strange, glowing symbols. The air here was even colder, each breath forming a cloud that hung in the air. In the center of the chamber stood another altar, identical to the one they had seen before. But this one was different. It was surrounded by a circle of glowing, pulsating light, a barrier of some kind. Tessa stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with awe and dread. "This is what the map was leading us to." The artifact in Mia's hands pulsed again, its light growing brighter. The chamber responded, the glowing symbols on the walls shifting and changing. The barrier around the altar flickered, as though reacting to their presence. "What now?" Carter asked, his voice filled with apprehension. Tessa turned to Mia, her expression grim. "We finish what we started." The narrow tunnel stretched out before them, its jagged walls glistening with moisture and faint traces of the strange mineral that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of their throats. Every step echoed unearthingly, the sound bouncing off the cavern walls and disappearing into the void ahead. Tessa led the way, her lantern held high, its flickering light casting long, jittery shadows. The compass in her hand had stopped spinning erratically and now pointed firmly ahead. This small victory gave her a flicker of hope, though it was dimmed by the oppressive weight of the cavern pressing down on them. Behind her, Mia clutched the artifact tightly, her knuckles white. Its glow illuminated her face, highlighting the fear etched into her features. The artifact's hum had grown stronger with each step, resonating through her hands and into her very bones. It felt alive, as if it were guiding them or warning them. Carter brought up the rear, his flashlight beam darting from one shadow to the next. He hated being at the back, hated the way the darkness seemed to press against him like a living thing. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, his heart hammering in his chest, half expecting to see the creature's glowing eyes staring back at him. "Do you think it's still back there?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It can't follow us," Tessa replied without turning around. Her voice was steady, but there was a tension in it that betrayed her doubt. The passage was too narrow. "Yeah, but something that big doesn't just give up," Carter muttered, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "What if it's waiting for us to come back out?" "Then we make sure we don't go back out," Tessa said firmly. She glanced back at him, her expression hard. "The only way is forward." Mia said nothing, her focus entirely on the artifact. The patterns on its surface had become more intricate, shifting and swirling like a living thing. She could feel its energy pulsing against her skin, a strange rhythmic vibration that seemed to match the faint thumping sound they had heard earlier. The tunnel began to widen, and the group found themselves in another chamber. This one was smaller than the previous ones, but its walls were covered in the same glowing symbols they had seen before. The light from the artifact seemed to bring them to life, the symbols pulsating in time with its glow. "What is this place?" Mia murmured, stepping closer to the walls. She reached out to touch one of the symbols, but Tessa grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said sharply. "We don't know what they do." Mia hesitated, then nodded. She lowered her hand, but her eyes remained fixed on the symbols, a mixture of fascination and unease in her gaze. Carter shone his flashlight around the chamber, his beam landing on a pile of rocks near the far wall. At first he thought it was just debris, but as he moved closer, he realized it was something else entirely. Guys," he said, his voice unsteady. "You might want to take a look at this." Tessa and Mia joined him, their lanterns casting additional light on the pile. It wasn't rocks, it was bones. A tangled heap of skeletal remains, their surfaces darkened and weathered with age. Some of the bones were cracked, others shattered, as if by something with immense force. "What the hell happened here?" Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it was, it wasn't friendly," Tessa replied grimly. She knelt down, examining one of the larger bones. It had deep gouges in it, as if something had gnawed on it. "These aren't animal bones," she added, her voice tight. "They're human." Mia stepped back, her face pale. "We shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "This place. It's wrong." "We don't have a choice," Tessa said, standing up. She looked at Mia, her expression hard but not unkind. "You know that. We're in too deep." Mia said nothing, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. She clutched the artifact tighter, as if it could protect her from whatever horrors lay ahead. The group pressed on, leaving the chamber and its grim secrets behind. The tunnel beyond was wider now, its walls smoother, almost polished. The faint thumping sound grew louder, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead. "What do you think that is?" Carter asked, his voice hushed. "Whatever it is," Tessa replied, "it's what we're here to find." "That's not exactly comforting," Carter muttered, but he said no more. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, and the glow from the artifact seemed to intensify, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The symbols they had seen before were more frequent now, covering almost every surface. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a massive chamber. The group stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening as they took in the sight before them. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness. In the center stood a massive structure, its surface carved with the same symbols that adorned the walls. It was shaped like an altar, but it was far larger and more intricate than anything they had seen before. The thumping sound was louder here, emanating from the structure itself. It pulsed with a faint, eerie light, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Mia took a step forward, the artifact in her hands glowing brighter than ever. It seemed to vibrate with excitement, as if it recognized the structure. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible. "This is what it's been leading us to." Tessa nodded, her eyes fixed on the altar. Then let's find out why. The group approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. As they drew closer, the thumping sound grew almost deafening, resonating through their bodies like a second heartbeat. When they reached the base of the altar, Mia hesitated. The artifact in her hands was pulsing violently now, its glow almost blinding. She could feel its energy coursing through her, filling her with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. "What do we do now?" Carter asked, his voice tight. Mia looked at the artifact, then at the altar. I think it wants me to place it here," she said, pointing to a shallow depression in the center of the structure. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Carter asked, his eyes darting nervously around the chamber. "No," Mia admitted. "But I don't think we have a choice." Tessa placed a hand on Mia's shoulder. "Do it," she said. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Mia nodded, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. She placed the artifact in the depression, its glow illuminating the chamber like a second sun. For a moment nothing happened. Then the altar began to tremble, the symbols on its surface glowing brightly. The thumping sound grew louder, transforming into a deep, resonant hum that filled the air. The group stepped back, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. The chamber seemed to come alive around them, the walls pulsing with light and energy. And then, from the depths of the altar, something began to emerge. The chamber shook violently as the altar came to life. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. The glow from the artifact intensified, illuminating the intricate carvings on the altar and casting chaotic shadows across the vast chamber. Tessa, Mia, and Carter stood frozen, their gazes fixed on the altar as something began to emerge. From the depression where Mia had placed the artifact, a column of light shot upward, piercing the darkness above. It was blinding, a pure white beam that seemed to carry a strange, unearthly energy. The hum grew louder, transforming into a low, rhythmic pulse that resonated in their chests like the beat of a massive heart. "What's happening?" Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. He shielded his eyes from the light, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I don't know," Tessa yelled back, her voice strained. She clutched the compass in her hand, though its needle spun uselessly, as if overwhelmed by the energy in the room. "But whatever it is, we're in the middle of it now." Mia stood closest to the altar, her hands trembling as she stared at the artifact. It seemed to pulse in time with a beam of light, its symbols shifting and swirling in a mesmerizing dance. She could feel its energy coursing through her, filling her with a strange sense of connection, like she was part of something far greater than herself. "It's communicating," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What?" Carter asked, stepping closer. "What do you mean, communicating?" Mia turned to face him, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice trembling. It's speaking to me. Not with words but with feelings, images. I can't describe it." Before Carter could respond, the light shifted. The column began to widen, its edges rippling like water. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, a sound that sent a shiver down their spines. The light dimmed slightly, revealing a shape within. At first it was just a silhouette, indistinct and formless. But as the light continued to fade, the figure became clearer. It was massive, its body covered in jagged, angular shapes that seemed to shimmer and shift like liquid metal. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with an intense, otherworldly light, locking onto the group with an almost predatory focus. "What the hell is that?" Carter whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Tessa replied, her voice tight. She took a step back, her eyes never leaving the creature. "But it doesn't look friendly." The creature let out a low growl, its body rippling as it stepped forward. The ground beneath it seemed to melt and reform with each movement, as though the creature's very presence was distorting reality. Mia took a step back, clutching the artifact tightly. She could feel its energy surging, reacting to the creature's presence. The connection she had felt before was stronger now, almost overwhelming. It was as if the artifact were trying to guide her, to tell her what to do, but the message was fragmented, incomplete. "What do we do?" Carter asked, his voice rising in panic. He glanced at Tessa, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "We can't fight that thing." "We're not fighting it," Tessa said, her voice firm. "We're figuring out what it wants." "What it wants?" Carter repeated, incredulous. "It looks like it wants to eat us." "Shut up and let me think." Tessa snapped, her mind racing. She looked at the altar, at the artifact, at the creature. There had to be a connection, something they were missing. The creature took another step forward, its growl deepening. The air around it shimmered, distorting the light and making it difficult to focus on its form. It was both there and not there, a being that seemed to exist on the edges of reality. "Mia," Tessa said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "The artifact, what is it telling you?" Mia hesitated, her eyes locked on the creature. It's saying we need to complete something," she said, her voice trembling. "But I don't know what." "Complete what?" Tessa demanded, her frustration mounting. "We don't have time for riddles." The creature let out a roar, a sound so loud and deep that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. The glow from the artifact flared, and the symbols on its surface shifted rapidly, their patterns becoming more complex. Mia's eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. "It's a sequence," she said, her voice filled with sudden clarity. "The symbols, they're a sequence. We have to match them to the ones on the altar." "Then do it," Tessa shouted, glancing nervously at the creature. "Before that thing decides we're dinner." Mia stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held the artifact up to the altar. The symbols on the artifact seemed to respond, their light intensifying as they aligned with the carvings on the altar's surface. One by one, the symbols began to lock into place, their glow spreading across the altar like a ripple of light. The creature roared again, its movements becoming more erratic. It lunged forward, but as it approached the altar, it was repelled by an invisible barrier. The force of the impact sent it stumbling back, its growl filled with frustration. "It's working," Carter shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and terror. "Keep going." Mia focused on the artifact, her mind racing to decipher the patterns. Each symbol seemed to resonate with a specific part of the altar, and as she aligned them, the hum in the chamber grew louder. The light from the artifact spread further, illuminating more of the carvings and casting the creature in stark relief. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes locked onto Mia. It began to circle the altar, its movements fluid and menacing. The barrier held, but it was clear that the creature wasn't going to give up easily. "Hurry up, Mia," Tessa urged, her voice tight with urgency. She glanced at Carter, who was frantically searching the chamber for anything they could use as a weapon. "We're running out of time." "I'm trying," Mia snapped, sweat dripping down her forehead despite the cold. Her hands shook as she aligned another symbol, the light flaring brighter with each connection. The creature lunged again, testing the barrier with a powerful swipe of its massive claws. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, causing loose rocks to tumble from the ceiling. The group ducked instinctively, their fear mounting. With one final push, Mia aligned the last symbol. The artifact's light exploded outward, engulfing the altar and the creature in a blinding flash. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and then silence. When the light faded, the chamber was eerily still. The creature was gone, its massive form replaced by a faint shimmer in the air. The altar stood silent, its carvings dim and lifeless. Mia collapsed to her knees, the artifact slipping from her hands. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Tessa and Carter rushed to her side, their faces pale but filled with relief. "Is it over?" Carter asked, his voice shaky. "I think so," Tessa replied, though her tone was uncertain. She looked at the artifact, now dark and inert. But we still don't know what we just did. Mia looked up, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. We opened something, she said quietly. But I don't think it's over. Not yet. The silence that followed the blinding flash was almost more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. The once deafening hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed down on the group like a suffocating weight. The cavern, illuminated moments ago by the artifact's light, now seemed darker than ever, its shadows deeper and more oppressive. Mia remained on her knees, staring blankly at the now dormant artifact lying in front of her. Its glow had vanished, leaving behind a dull, lifeless object that looked nothing like the pulsating, vibrant key it had been moments before. Her hands trembled, her body racked with exhaustion. Tessa crouched beside her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Mia, are you okay?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with concern. Mia didn't respond immediately. She was still processing the strange surge of energy she had felt during the alignment process, a sensation that had seemed to connect her to something vast and incomprehensible. Finally, she nodded weakly. I'm fine," she whispered. "But it's not over." "What do you mean?" Carter demanded, his flashlight darting around the chamber as though the creature might reappear at any moment. "That thing's gone, right? We saw it disappear." "It's not gone," Mia replied, her voice trembling. "We didn't destroy it. We released it." Her words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Carter swore under his breath, pacing back and forth as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. "Released it? What does that even mean? What the hell did we just do?" Tessa stood, her expression grim as she scanned the chamber. The carvings on the walls and altar, once alive with light and energy, were now cold and dark. The faint shimmer where the creature had been still lingered, like a fading echo of its presence. "We need answers," Tessa said finally. She turned to Mia. "You said the artifact was communicating with you. Did it tell you anything about what we were doing, or what happens next?" Mia hesitated, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall the fragmented impressions she had received. "It wasn't clear," she admitted. "It was like flashes of something ancient, something that had been trapped for a long time. The symbols on the altar, they were a lock, and the artifact was the key. And we just unlocked it," Carter said bitterly, his voice rising in frustration. "Great. Fantastic. So what now? Do we wait around for whatever nightmare comes next?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, growing steadily louder. The shimmer where the creature had been expanded, its edges rippling like water disturbed by a stone. It wasn't fading, it was growing stronger. "Move!" Tessa shouted, grabbing Mia by the arm and pulling her to her feet. "We need to get out of here." The group scrambled toward the nearest tunnel, their footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous space. Behind them, the shimmering rift continued to expand, its glow casting eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. The air around it seemed to warp and distort, as though reality itself were unraveling. As they ran, the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, the walls narrowing and twisting in unnatural ways. The faint glow of their lanterns and flashlights barely pierced the oppressive darkness. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than ever, and with it came a feeling of dread that made every step harder to take. "What's happening?" Carter gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Why does it feel like we're not getting anywhere?" "It's the rift," Mia said, her voice strained. "It's warping everything around it. Space-time. It's all connected." "That's not possible," Carter shot back, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, he knew that nothing about this place followed the rules of the world they knew. "Possible or not, it's happening," Tessa said grimly. She glanced back, her heart sinking as she saw the glow from the rift creeping closer. "And if we don't figure something out fast, it's going to catch us." Ahead, the tunnel suddenly opened into another chamber, smaller and less elaborate than the one they had just left. The group stumbled inside, their breaths ragged as they tried to catch their breath. The walls here were bare, free of the carvings and symbols that had marked the rest of the cavern. "What now?" Carter asked, leaning against the wall as he tried to steady his breathing. "We're trapped. That thing's going to swallow us whole." "No, we're not trapped," Tessa said, her voice resolute. She stepped into the center of the chamber, her eyes scanning the walls and floor for any clue, any hint of a way forward. "There's always a way out. We just have to find it." Mia knelt on the floor, picking up the artifact once more. Though it was dark and inert, she could still feel a faint warmth emanating from it, as though it were waiting for something. "It's still connected," she murmured. "The artifact. It's still part of this." Tessa turned to her, her expression intense. "What do you mean? Can it stop the rift?" Mia shook her head. "I don't know. But I think it can guide us. We just have to figure out how to activate it again." As she spoke, the ground trembled once more. The rift's glow was visible now, spilling into the chamber like a tide of light and energy. The distorted air around it seemed to pulse, growing stronger with each passing moment. "There's no time," Carter shouted, his voice edged with panic. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Mia closed her eyes, gripping the artifact tightly. She focused on the faint warmth, on the memory of the energy that had coursed through it when it was active. Slowly, she began to feel something, a faint vibration like the first stirrings of a heartbeat. "It's responding," she said, her voice steady despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "But I need more time." The rift surged forward, its edges reaching the entrance of the chamber. The walls seemed to ripple as it approached, the air growing colder and heavier. Tessa and Carter stepped in front of Mia, their bodies tense as they prepared to face whatever came next. "Just tell us what to do," Tessa said, her voice calm and determined. Mia opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the rift. "We have to stabilize it," she said. "It's not just a doorway, it's a wound. If we can close it, we might be able to stop it from spreading." "And how do we do that?" Carter asked, his voice trembling. Mia held up the artifact. "This is the key," she said. "But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Tessa and Carter exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Tell us what to do," Tessa said firmly. Mia guided them to positions around the chamber, instructing them to hold their lanterns at specific angles to reflect light onto the artifact. As the light struck its surface, the symbols began to glow faintly, their patterns shifting once more. The rift surged again, its edges now brushing against the walls of the chamber. The group worked quickly, their movements coordinated as they channeled the artifact's energy. The glow intensified, spreading outward in waves that seemed to push back against the rift. For a moment it seemed to work. The rift's advance slowed, its glow dimming slightly. But then, with a deafening roar, it surged forward again, its energy overwhelming the chamber. Mia screamed as the artifact flared with light, its energy exploding outward. The group was thrown to the ground as the chamber was consumed by the blinding glow. And then everything went dark. When the light finally faded, the oppressive silence that followed was deafening. Mia, Tessa, and Carter lay sprawled on the cold, uneven floor of the chamber, their bodies aching from the blast. The air was thick with a scent of ozone and something far more alien, something that carried a metallic tang and an undercurrent of decay. Mia was the first to stir. She groaned softly, her hands groping blindly for the artifact. Her fingers brushed against its surface, and she was surprised to find it intact, though it felt different now. Its warmth was gone, replaced by an unsettling coldness that sent a shiver through her. "Is everyone okay?" she croaked, her voice barely audible in the stillness. Tessa groaned and sat up, wincing as she clutched her side. "Define okay," she muttered, her voice laced with sarcasm. She glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the chamber. "What the hell just happened?" Carter coughed, rolling onto his side. "I think we just got blasted by that." "Whatever that was," he said, his voice hoarse. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his eyes narrowing as he took in their surroundings. Is it gone? The chamber was unrecognizable. The walls, once etched with strange symbols, were now smooth and featureless, as though the blast had erased them completely. The rift, which had threatened to consume them, was nowhere to be seen. The oppressive glow and the distortion in the air were gone, leaving behind only darkness. Mia clutched the artifact tightly, her mind racing. It felt heavier now, its surface cold and lifeless. She could no longer feel the faint hum or the pulsing energy that had connected her to it. "I don't think it's gone," she said softly. "It's just somewhere else." Tessa turned to her, frowning. "What do you mean, somewhere else?" Mia shook her head, struggling to put her thoughts into words. The rift, it wasn't just a portal. It was a connection to something. And when we used the artifact to stop it, I think we severed that connection. But I don't think we destroyed it. So what? Carter snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. We just delayed the inevitable. That thing, or things, could come back at any moment. I don't know, Mia admitted, her voice trembling. But I think we need to find out. Tessa stood, brushing dirt and debris from her clothes. Well, standing around here isn't going to give us answers, she said firmly. She reached down and helped Mia to her feet, her grip steady and reassuring. We need to figure out where we are and what's left of this place. Carter groaned but followed suit, his flashlight flickering weakly as he swept the beam around the chamber. This place doesn't look the same, he muttered. It's like it's been wiped clean. The chamber, once filled with carvings and symbols, was now a smooth, featureless expanse. Even the altar, the focal point of their ritual, was gone. The only thing that remained was the artifact in Mia's hands, its surface dull and cold. As they moved toward the far end of the chamber, the air grew heavier, thick with an almost tangible tension. The tunnel that had led them here was gone, replaced by a narrow passage that seemed to spiral downward into the earth. Tessa stopped, her hand resting on the smooth wall. This wasn't here before, she said, her voice tinged with unease. Mia stepped closer, peering into the darkness of the passage. It feels different, she said softly. Like it's pulling us. Carter snorted. Great. Because following creepy, reality-bending tunnels has worked out so well for us so far. Tessa shot him a sharp look. Do you have a better idea? Because standing here isn't going to help. Carter opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. Instead, he sighed and motioned toward the passage. Lead the way, fearless leader. The group descended into the passage, the walls narrowing around them. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint rhythmic sound began to echo through the tunnel, a sound that reminded them all too much of the rift's pulse. Do you hear that? Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tessa nodded, her grip tightening on the compass in her hand. The needle, which had been spinning erratically for most of their journey, was now completely still, pointing directly ahead. It's coming from down there, she said, her voice steady but grim. Carter shivered, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls. Why do I feel like we're walking straight into another trap? Because we probably are, Tessa admitted. But we don't have a choice. As they continued deeper into the passage, the rhythmic sound grew louder, resonating through their bodies like a heartbeat. The walls around them began to change, the smooth surface giving way to jagged, crystalline formations that glowed faintly in the darkness. Mia stopped, her eyes widening as she studied the crystals. These are the same as the ones we saw near the rift, she said, her voice filled with both wonder and dread. They're connected to it. Tessa nodded, her jaw set. Then we're getting closer. The passage finally opened into a vast, cavernous space. The group froze as they took in the sight before them. The chamber was massive, its walls lined with the same glowing crystals. At its center was a massive structure, similar to the altar they had seen before but far more intricate and imposing. The structure pulsed with a faint, eerie light, its surface covered in shifting patterns that seemed to move in time with a rhythmic sound. The energy in the room was palpable, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. What is this place? Carter whispered, his voice barely audible. Mia stepped forward, her eyes locked on the structure. It's the source, she said softly. The heart of whatever this is. Tessa approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. If this is the source, then maybe we can use the artifact to stop it, she said. For good this time. Mia hesitated, clutching the artifact tightly. I don't know if we can, she said, her voice trembling. It feels different, stronger. We have to try, Tessa said firmly. She turned to face Mia, her expression resolute. Whatever's happening here, we're the only ones who can stop it. Carter groaned, rubbing his temples. Why does it always have to be us? Mia took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the artifact. Because we're the ones who opened it, she said. And it's our responsibility to close it. With that, she stepped forward, the artifact in her hands beginning to glow faintly once more. The chamber seemed to respond to its presence, the pulsing light of the crystals intensifying as she approached the structure. As she placed the artifact on the structure, the room was suddenly bathed in blinding light. The rhythmic sound grew louder, filling the chamber with a deafening roar. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to close in around them. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded, leaving the group in darkness once more. The chamber fell silent, the kind of silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. Mia, Tessa, and Carter stood frozen, their breaths ragged and shallow as their eyes adjusted to the oppressive darkness. The artifact, once vibrant and pulsing with life, now lay dormant on the central structure, its surface dull and cold. The faint crystalline glow from the chamber's walls had dimmed to near extinction, leaving them in a haze of uncertainty. What just happened? Carter whispered, his voice barely audible in the suffocating stillness. I don't know, Mia replied, her voice trembling. Her hands hovered over the artifact, as if expecting it to come back to life. But it remained inert, offering no answers, no guidance. Tessa tightened her grip on the compass, though its needle remained frustratingly still. The rift's energy, it was drawn into this structure, she said, trying to make sense of the events. But this place, it doesn't feel stable. The ground beneath them trembled faintly, a deep rumble that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of the chamber. The crystalline walls began to shimmer again, their faint light casting eerie, shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. Mia turned to Tessa, her face pale. I think we've only made it worse. Before Tessa could respond, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the air. It was a shriek, high-pitched and otherworldly, that sent chills racing down their spines. The crystals lining the walls pulsed violently in response, their light flaring in sync with the sound. Tell me that wasn't what I think it was, Carter muttered, his voice filled with dread. The shriek came again, louder this time, and with it came a wave of energy that rippled through the chamber. The walls seemed to warp and twist, the crystalline formations elongating and contorting into grotesque, jagged shapes. The air grew colder, and a faint mist began to seep from the ground, coiling around their feet like living tendrils. Mia's heart pounded as she clutched the artifact to her chest. It's not just one rift, she said, her voice trembling. There are more, and they're opening. More, Carter exclaimed, his eyes wide with panic. How do we stop something like that? Tessa didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the structure at the center of the chamber, its surface now pulsating with a faint, sickly light. The symbols etched into it had begun to shift and change, forming patterns that seemed to ripple across its surface like waves. It's a gateway, Tessa said, realization dawning in her voice. This isn't just a source of energy. It's a conduit. For what? Carter demanded. For that thing we saw earlier. Or worse. Tessa's jaw tightened. Whatever it is, we have to stop it here. If we don't, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, and cracks began to spread across the chamber floor. The mist thickened, rising higher and obscuring their vision. From somewhere deep within the chamber came the sound of movement, heavy, deliberate footsteps that echoed ominously in the confined space. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "It's coming," she whispered. The group instinctively backed away from the central structure, their eyes darting toward the source of the sound. Through the mist, a massive shape began to emerge, its form indistinct but undeniably monstrous. Its jagged silhouette seemed to shift and ripple, as though it were made of the same distorted energy as the rift. "Run!" Tessa shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the far side of the chamber. Carter followed, his flashlight beam flickering as he stumbled over the uneven ground. "Where are we even supposed to go?" he yelled. "We're trapped." "We're not trapped," Tessa shot back, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We just have to find another way out." The creature let out another ear-piercing shriek, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a physical force. The mist swirled violently around it, obscuring its form but not its presence. It moved with terrifying speed, its massive limbs striking the ground with enough force to send cracks spiderwebbing through the floor. Mia clutched the artifact tightly, her mind racing. She could feel its faint warmth returning, a flicker of energy that gave her a spark of hope. "The artifact, it's responding," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Can you use it?" Tessa asked, glancing back at her. "I don't know," Mia admitted, her hands trembling. "But I think it's connected to this place. If I can figure out how to channel its energy." "Then figure it out fast," Carter shouted, his voice rising in panic as the creature closed the distance between them. "Because we don't have much time." Mia stopped abruptly, turning to face the creature as it loomed closer. The artifact in her hands began to glow faintly, its symbols shifting once more. She closed her eyes, focusing on the energy she could feel coursing through it. It was like trying to grasp the edges of a dream, fleeting and elusive but undeniably real. The creature lunged, its massive limbs crashing down just feet away from her. The ground shook violently, and Mia nearly lost her balance. But she held her ground, her eyes snapping open as the artifact flared to life. The light from the artifact erupted outward, forming a shimmering barrier that halted the creature's advance. It roared in frustration, its jagged limbs clawing at the barrier, but it held firm. "It's working," Mia shouted, her voice filled with both relief and determination. "But I can't hold it for long." Tessa and Carter rushed to her side, their expressions a mixture of awe and desperation. "What do you need us to do?" Tessa asked. Mia hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward the central structure. "The gateway, it's still active. We need to shut it down completely. If we can overload it with energy, it might collapse." "And how do we do that?" Carter asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Mia held up the artifact, its light pulsing in her hands. "This is the key. But I'll need your help to focus the energy. The crystals on the walls, they're connected to the structure. If we can channel the artifact's power through them, it should be enough to destroy the gateway." Tessa nodded, her jaw set. "Then let's do it." The group moved quickly, working together to position the artifact and align the crystals. The creature continued to rage against the barrier, its roars shaking the chamber. The light from the artifact grew brighter, its energy building to a crescendo. As Mia focused on the artifact, the patterns on its surface began to align with the symbols on the structure. The room trembled violently, and the crystals along the walls flared with blinding light. "Almost there," Mia shouted, her voice strained from the effort. With a final surge of energy, the artifact's light erupted outward, engulfing the chamber. The gateway trembled violently, its surface fracturing as the energy overwhelmed it. The creature let out one final, deafening shriek before being consumed by the light. And then silence. When the light faded, the chamber was empty. The gateway was gone, and the creature with it. The group stood in the eerie stillness, their breaths ragged as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. "Did we do it?" Carter asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Mia held the artifact in her hands, its surface now dark and cold. She nodded slowly, a faint smile of relief crossing her face. I think we did. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was only temporary, and that the veil between worlds would not remain intact for long. The chamber, once a beacon of chaos and light, now lay eerily still. The smooth walls were cracked, and the faint crystalline glow had faded entirely. The air was heavy, saturated with the aftermath of the energy surge that had torn through the room. Mia, Tessa, and Carter stood in silence, their exhaustion palpable. The artifact in Mia's hands was completely inert, its surface dull and cold. What now? Carter asked, breaking the silence. His voice echoed faintly in the vast space, but there was no answer, only the oppressive quiet of a place that felt fundamentally wrong. We shut it down. That thing is gone, right? So why does it still feel like we're standing in a graveyard? Mia exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the artifact. Because we didn't just destroy the gateway, she said softly. We broke something bigger than this place. Tessa frowned, her grip tightening on the compass. What do you mean, something bigger? The rift, Mia explained, her voice trembling. It wasn't just a doorway to another dimension. It was part of a network, a web of connections stretching across everything. She looked up, meeting Tessa's eyes. When we overloaded it, we didn't just close it. We fractured the web. And now it's unraveling. Carter groaned, running a hand through his hair. Great. So not only did we unleash a monster, we've also torn apart the fabric of reality. Fantastic. Tessa ignored his sarcasm, her mind racing. If the web is unraveling, what does that mean for us? For this world? I don't know, Mia admitted, her voice barely audible. But I don't think this is over. Not even close. As if in response to her words, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration that could almost be dismissed as their imagination. But it quickly grew stronger, the tremors rippling through the chamber like the aftershock of an earthquake. Move! Tessa shouted, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the nearest tunnel. Carter followed close behind, his flashlight swinging wildly as the ground continued to shake. The tunnel ahead was narrow, its walls lined with jagged cracks that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The air grew colder as they descended, each step taking them deeper into the unknown. The tremor subsided, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on them. We need to find a way out of here, Tessa said, her voice tight. This place isn't stable. No kidding, Carter muttered, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls. Any chance the artifact can tell us where to go, or is it just a fancy paperweight now? Mia frowned, turning the artifact over in her hands. It felt heavier than before, its surface cold and unresponsive. But as she concentrated, she felt the faintest flicker of energy, a whisper of something still alive within it. It's not completely gone, she said quietly. There's still something there. But it's different. We need to figure out how to reactivate it. Tessa glanced back at her. Can you do that while we're moving? Because I don't think we can afford to stay in one place. Mia nodded, though her confidence was wavering. I'll try. They continued down the tunnel, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The faint glow from the cracks in the walls began to intensify, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the stone. The rhythmic hum that had accompanied the rift earlier was gone, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whispering sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Do you hear that? Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He stopped, shining his flashlight on the walls. It's like voices. Tessa paused, her eyes narrowing as she listened. The whispers were faint, indistinct, but they carried a haunting quality that sent chills down her spine. It's coming from the cracks, she said. Like the walls are alive. That's comforting, Carter muttered, stepping back from the glowing fissures. Mia stepped closer to the wall, her brow furrowing as she studied the cracks. The light within them seemed to pulse faintly, almost like a heartbeat. She reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing against the stone. The moment she made contact, a surge of energy shot through her, and her vision blurred. She staggered back, gasping for breath as images flooded her mind. Flashes of otherworldly landscapes, towering structures made of light, and creatures that defied description. She could hear voices, distant and fragmented, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Mia! Tessa grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. What happened? Mia shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. I saw something, she said, her voice trembling. It was like the cracks were showing me another world. Or maybe pieces of several worlds. Carter frowned, his skepticism clear. And what does that mean for us? Mia hesitated, glancing at the artifact in her hands. I think the web isn't just unraveling here. It's happening everywhere. These cracks, they're like windows into the other worlds. And if they keep spreading... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. Tessa nodded, her expression grim. Then we need to find a way to stop it. If the artifact is still connected to the web, maybe it can help us repair it. And how do we do that? Carter asked, his frustration evident. We don't even know where we are, let alone how to fix a broken reality. Mia studied the artifact, her fingers tracing the faint patterns etched into its surface. There's still energy inside it, she said. But it's weak. We need to find a way to recharge it, to reconnect it to the web. Any idea how we do that? Tessa asked. Mia glanced at the glowing cracks in the walls. I think these fissures are connected to the web, she said. If we can harness their energy, it might be enough to reactivate the artifact. Carter raised an eyebrow. And by harness, you mean? I'm not sure yet, Mia admitted. But I think it involves the artifact. It's still linked to the web. We just need to figure out how to use it. Tessa nodded, her determination unwavering. Then let's keep moving. We'll figure it out as we go. The group pressed on, the whispers growing louder as the glowing cracks became more frequent. The air grew heavier, filled with a sense of something vast and ancient stirring just beyond the veil of reality. Mia clutched the artifact tightly, her mind racing as she tried to decipher its secrets. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, they came to a sudden stop. Before them was another chamber, its walls lined with the same glowing crystals they had seen earlier. But this chamber was different. At its center stood a massive structure, similar to the gateway they had destroyed but far more intricate and imposing. The structure pulsed with a faint, eerie light, its surface covered in shifting patterns that seemed to ripple like water. The air around it was thick with energy, and the whispers were louder here, almost deafening. What is that? Carter asked, his voice tinged with awe and fear. Mia stepped forward, her eyes locked on the structure. It's another node, she said softly. Another connection point in the web. And what do we do with it? Tessa asked, her voice steady but tense. Mia turned to face them, her expression resolute. We fix it. The chamber loomed before them, vast and imposing. The structure at its center pulsed faintly, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. The energy in the room was palpable, a thick, invisible force that seemed to hum just beneath the surface of reality. The glowing crystals embedded in the walls refracted the light from the structure, creating an eerie kaleidoscope of shifting colors. Tessa, Mia, and Carter stood at the chamber's threshold, their faces pale but resolute. The whispers that had followed them through the tunnels were louder here, overlapping and echoing in a way that made it impossible to discern individual voices. It was as though the chamber itself was alive, speaking to them in a language they couldn't understand. This is it, Mia said softly, her gaze fixed on the central structure. This is where we can start to fix what we broke. Carter frowned, his flashlight flickering as he scanned the room. And how exactly do we do that? Because last time we tried messing with one of these things, we nearly got eaten by a nightmare. It's different this time, Mia replied, clutching the artifact tightly. Its surface had begun to warm again, faint patterns of light flickering across its surface. The web is already broken. We're not fighting against it. We're trying to reconnect it. Tessa stepped forward, her jaw set. If we're going to do this, we need a plan. Mia, you're the only one who seems to understand how this works. What do we need to do? Mia took a deep breath, focusing on the artifact in her hands. She could feel its energy growing, resonating with the pulsing light of the structure. The artifact is a conduit, she explained. It can channel the energy from this node and use it to repair the web. But I need to align it with the patterns on the structure, just like before. And what happens when you do that? Carter asked, his voice tense. I'm not sure, Mia admitted, her voice trembling slightly. But I think it will trigger a reaction, a surge of energy that will start to weave the connections back together. Carter groaned, running a hand through his hair. Great. So we're just going to wing it again. Fantastic. Tessa shot him a sharp look. Do you have a better idea? Carter opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it. Instead, he sighed and nodded. Fine. Let's get this over with. The group moved cautiously toward the central structure, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. As they approached, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The patterns on the structure's surface shifted constantly, rippling like water as the energy within it pulsed in time with the glowing crystals on the walls. Mia knelt in front of the structure, her hands trembling as she placed the artifact in a shallow depression at its base. The moment it made contact, the patterns on the artifact flared to life, their light merging with the shifting designs on the structure. The hum in the chamber grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath them. It's responding, Mia said, her voice filled with both awe and fear. The connection is starting to form. Tessa and Carter stood behind her, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. The last time they had activated a node like this, the rift had opened, unleashing a creature that had nearly killed them. They had no reason to believe this time would be any different. What do you need us to do? Tessa asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Mia glanced back at her, her brow furrowed in concentration. The crystals on the walls, they're part of the web, she said. If you can position the lanterns to reflect light onto them, it should amplify the artifact's energy. Tessa nodded, motioning for Carter to follow her. The two of them began positioning their lanterns, angling the beams of light toward the crystals. As the light struck the crystalline surfaces, the patterns on the walls flared to life, their glow spreading outward in rippling waves. It's working, Mia said, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The energy is stabilizing. The structure began to hum, its light intensifying as the patterns on its surface aligned with those on the artifact. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, their overlapping voices creating a cacophony that filled the room. Mia closed her eyes, focusing on the connection she could feel forming between the artifact and the node. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them shook violently. Cracks spread across the chamber floor, glowing faintly as energy surged through them. The light from the crystals flickered, and the patterns on the structure began to destabilize. What's happening? Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. The connection isn't holding. Mia yelled, her hands gripping the artifact tightly. There's too much energy. It's overwhelming the node. Tessa rushed to Mia's side, her eyes scanning the structure for any sign of a solution. What do we do? She demanded. Mia hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the energy building, threatening to tear the node apart. We need to disperse the energy, she said finally. Redirect it into the surrounding crystals. And how do we do that? Carter asked, his voice rising in panic. The artifact can do it, Mia said, her voice filled with determination. But it needs more power. Help me stabilize it. Tessa and Carter knelt beside her, their hands joining hers on the artifact. The moment they made contact, a surge of energy coursed through them, connecting them to the artifact and the node. The light from the crystals flared, and the patterns on the structure began to realign. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, their overlapping voices merging into a single resonant hum. The energy within the room seemed to reach a tipping point, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire chamber was about to collapse. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the energy surged outward, spreading through the cracks in the walls and into the surrounding crystals. The patterns on the structure stabilized, and the hum in the chamber began to subside. The group collapsed to the ground, their bodies trembling from the effort. The light from the crystals dimmed but didn't fade completely, leaving the chamber bathed in a faint, soothing glow. "Did we do it?" Carter asked, his voice shaky. Mia nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the artifact. Its surface was warm again, the patterns glowing faintly. "We reconnected this node," she said. "But there are more out there. If we don't stabilize them all, the web will keep unraveling." Tessa pushed herself to her feet, her expression resolute. "Then we keep going," she said. "We find the other nodes and fix them, no matter what it takes." Carter groaned but nodded, his eyes filled with a reluctant determination. "Fine. But next time, let's try not to almost die in the process." Mia managed a faint smile, her hands clutching the artifact tightly. "Next time," she said softly, "we'll be ready." The group gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the chamber, the faint glow of the crystals lighting their way. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure: their journey was far from over. The faint glow of the crystals lit their path as Mia, Tessa, and Carter navigated the narrow, jagged tunnel leading away from the node chamber. The air was thick, tinged with a metallic taste that clung to the back of their throats. The artifact in Mia's hands pulsed faintly, its warmth a small comfort amidst the growing unease that settled over the group. "Do you feel that?" Tessa asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, cautious, as though she feared speaking too loudly would awaken something in the shadows. Carter grunted. "If by that you mean the creepy sense that something is watching us, then yeah, I feel it." Mia stayed quiet, her eyes focused on the glowing patterns shifting across the surface of the artifact. It was faint, but she could feel something, a distant tug like a thread pulling at the edges of her consciousness. She couldn't tell if it was guiding her or warning her. As they continued down the tunnel, the air grew colder. The once steady glow of the crystals flickered intermittently, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The whispers that had filled the node chamber were gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to resonate through the very stone around them. "This place is falling apart," Carter muttered, shining his flashlight ahead. The beam cut through the dark, revealing more jagged fissures splitting the walls and floor. "It's not just this place," Mia said softly, her voice barely audible. She stopped walking, clutching the artifact tightly as her brow furrowed in concentration. "The web is still unraveling. Stabilizing that node wasn't enough. The fractures are spreading." Tessa turned to face her, her expression grim. "What does that mean? For us? For the world?" Mia hesitated, her fingers tracing the patterns on the artifact. "I don't know for sure," she admitted. "But I think the nodes are interconnected. Each one we stabilize helps, but until we reconnect them all, the fractures will keep growing." "And if we don't stabilize them all?" Carter asked, his voice tinged with fear. Mia looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Then the fractures will spread unchecked. And everything, this world, the others, it'll all collapse." Carter swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "Great. No pressure." Tessa stepped closer to Mia, her gaze firm but kind. "Then we need to keep moving," she said. "We'll figure this out. Together." Mia nodded, grateful for Tessa's steadiness. The three of them pressed on, the tunnel narrowing as they descended deeper into the earth. The thrum grew louder, a constant vibration that seemed to pulse in time with the artifact. The faint glow from the crystals became more erratic, flickering like a dying flame. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. The air here was colder still, and the light from their lanterns barely penetrated the darkness. The floor was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and debris. At the far end of the cavern, A massive crack split the wall, its edges glowing faintly with the same eerie light as the crystals. "That's not good," Carter said, his voice low. He pointed to the crack, where faint tendrils of mist seeped through, coiling and twisting like living things. Mia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the crack. The artifact in her hands pulsed more strongly, its patterns shifting rapidly. "It's another fracture," she said. "Big one. If we don't stabilize it." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear. "Okay, so how do we stabilize it?" Tessa asked, her voice calm but urgent. Mia hesitated, her gaze fixed on the crack. "We need to draw the energy away from the fracture and redirect it into the artifact," she said. "But it's dangerous. The energy is unstable. Too much of it could overwhelm the artifact or us." "Dangerous is kind of our thing at this point," Carter said, attempting a weak smile. "What do we need to do?" Mia knelt on the ground, placing the artifact carefully in front of her. "We need to create a channel," she explained. "The crystals in this cavern are connected to the fracture. If we can align them, they'll act as conduits, directing the energy into the artifact." Tessa nodded, already moving to examine the nearest crystal formation. "Tell us what to do." Mia studied the patterns on the artifact, her mind racing as she tried to decipher its shifting symbols. "We need to adjust the angles of the crystals," she said. "They need to reflect the light from the fracture back toward the artifact." Carter groaned but moved to help, his flashlight beam dancing across the cavern walls. "Let's just hope this works," he muttered. The group worked quickly, repositioning the jagged crystal formations scattered throughout the cavern. As they adjusted each one, the faint glow from the fracture began to intensify, creating a network of light that pulsed in time with the artifact. "It's working," Mia said, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "The energy is starting to flow." The cavern began to tremble, the low thrum growing louder as the energy surged through the crystals. The artifact flared with light, its patterns shifting faster than ever. But as the energy built, the crack in the wall began to widen, its edges glowing brighter and emitting a piercing, otherworldly sound. "Mia, it's getting worse," Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Are you sure this is helping?" "We're almost there," Mia yelled back, her hands trembling as she focused on the artifact. She could feel the energy surging through it, a chaotic storm barely contained within its fragile shell. The ground beneath them shook violently, and several of the crystals shattered, sending shards of light scattering through the air. The fracture pulsed with a blinding intensity, and for a moment, it seemed as though it would consume the entire cavern. And then, with a deafening crack, the energy surged into the artifact. The fracture's glow faded, and the mist that had seeped through it evaporated. The cavern fell silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifting as the artifact's light stabilized. Mia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The artifact was warm in her hands, its patterns glowing faintly but steadily. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Tessa and Carter rushed to her side, their faces pale but relieved. "Is it stable?" Tessa asked, her eyes fixed on the artifact. Mia nodded weakly. "Now. But this was just one fracture. There are more out there, and they're getting worse." Carter groaned, leaning against a nearby rock. "Of course there are," he muttered. "Because why would anything be easy?" Tessa placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, her expression determined. "Then we keep going," she said. "We'll find the other fractures and stabilize them, one at a time." Mia managed a faint smile, her exhaustion evident. "Thank you," she said softly. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, gathering their strength. The path ahead was uncertain, and the challenges they faced were growing more daunting with each step. But they knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stop now. The web was broken, and only they could reweave it. The cavern's oppressive silence returned after the fracture had been sealed, leaving the group to sit in its heavy stillness. Mia, Tessa, and Carter leaned against the jagged walls, their breaths shallow and their bodies aching from the effort. The glow of the crystals was faint now, the artifact dim but steady in Mia's hands. Its warmth was a small but reassuring presence against the uncertainty that loomed. "We stabilized one fracture," Carter said, breaking the silence. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of weariness and frustration. "But how many more are out there? And how are we supposed to find them all before this whole web thing falls apart?" Mia didn't answer immediately. She stared at the artifact, her fingers tracing the shifting patterns on its surface. "The artifact is connected to the web," she said finally. "I think it can guide us. But the more fractures we stabilize, the stronger the resistance will be." Tessa straightened, her jaw tightening. "What do you mean by resistance?" Mia glanced at her, the shadows under her eyes dark. "The fractures aren't just tears in the fabric of reality," she explained. "They're points of contact between worlds, gateways, and some of the things on the other side. They don't want us to fix this." Carter let out a sharp laugh, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Great. So now we're fighting off interdimensional monsters while trying to save reality. Sounds like a walk in the park." Tessa ignored his sarcasm, her focus on Mia. "Can the artifact handle it? Can we handle it?" Mia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the artifact. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop the unraveling, everything will collapse. Our world, their worlds, all of it." Tessa nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we keep moving." As they prepared to leave the cavern, Mia held the artifact up, concentrating on its faint energy. A pulse of light rippled across its surface, and she felt a subtle tug, an invisible thread pulling her toward the next fracture. "This way," she said, leading them toward another tunnel that branched off from the cavern. The tunnel was narrow and winding, its walls covered in jagged crystal formations. The air grew colder as they descended, and the faint glow of the crystals cast eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The rhythmic hum of the web was faint here, like a distant heartbeat, but it grew stronger with each step. "Does it feel different to you?" Carter asked, his voice low. He glanced nervously at the shadows on the walls, his flashlight beam flickering. "Like we're being watched." "We are," Mia said softly, her grip on the artifact tightening. "The web is alive in its own way. And the fractures, they've attracted things that shouldn't be here." Tessa frowned, her hand instinctively going to the compass at her side. The needle was spinning erratically, as though unable to find a fixed point. "Are we walking into another fight?" Mia hesitated, then nodded. "Probably." They emerged from the tunnel into a vast open space that felt impossibly large. The cavern ceiling stretched high above them, lost in darkness, and the floor was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and crystalline debris. At the center of the cavern stood a towering structure, its surface covered in shifting patterns of light that pulsed in time with the artifact. The energy here was different, heavier, darker. The air was thick with tension, and the hum of the web was louder, almost deafening. The whispers they had heard before were back, overlapping and echoing in a way that made it impossible to discern individual voices. "This is a nexus," Mia said, her voice filled with awe and dread. "It's not just a fracture, it's a central point in the web. If we can stabilize this, it will ripple across the other nodes." "And if we fail?" Carter asked, his voice tight. Mia didn't answer. She didn't need to. The group approached the nexus cautiously, their eyes scanning the cavern for any sign of movement. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as they drew closer to the structure. The artifact in Mia's hands pulsed in response, its light flickering like a heartbeat. Tessa stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the shadows at the edge of the cavern. "Something's here," she said, her voice low. "I can feel it." Carter's flashlight darted toward the shadows, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. "Great. More monsters. Just what we needed." The whispers grew louder still, and the shadows began to shift. At first, it was subtle, barely perceptible movements at the edges of their vision. But as the group moved closer to the nexus, The shadows began to take shape, coalescing into dark, sinuous forms that seemed to ripple like smoke. "Get ready," Tessa said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The shadowy forms surged forward, their movements fluid and unnatural. They had no discernible features, only glowing, piercing eyes that radiated malice. The air grew colder as they approached, and the hum of the web became a chaotic roar. Mia knelt beside the nexus, placing the artifact in a shallow depression at its base. "I need time to stabilize it," she shouted over the noise. "Keep them back." Tessa and Carter moved to intercept the shadows, their lanterns and flashlights cutting through the darkness. The creatures recoiled from the light, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They moved with unnerving speed, circling the group like predators closing in on their prey. Tessa swung her lantern toward one of the creatures, the beam of light striking its form and causing it to dissolve into smoke. "Light hurts them," she yelled. "Use your flashlight." Carter nodded, his beam sweeping across the cavern. The creatures hissed and writhed, retreating from the light but refusing to disperse entirely. "There are too many of them," he shouted. "We can't hold them off forever." Mia focused on the artifact, her hands trembling as she aligned its patterns with the shifting designs on the nexus. The energy surged through her, filling her with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Almost there," she called out, her voice strained. The creatures grew more aggressive, their movements frantic as they closed in on the group. Tessa and Carter fought to hold them back, their beams of light flashing across the cavern in desperate arcs. With a final surge of effort, Mia aligned the last pattern. The artifact flared with blinding light, and a wave of energy erupted from the nexus, spreading outward in a brilliant ripple. The creatures screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the light consumed them. The cavern fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting as the nexus stabilized. The artifact in Mia's hands glowed brightly, its patterns steady and unchanging. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with relief. Tessa and Carter collapsed beside her, their faces pale but triumphant. "That was too close," Carter muttered, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Way too close." Tessa placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, her expression resolute. "One step at a time," she said. "We're making progress." Mia nodded, though her exhaustion was evident. "The web is stabilizing," she said. "But there's still more to do." The nexus was just the beginning. As they prepared to leave the cavern, the faint hum of the web echoed around them, a reminder of the task that still lay ahead. The fractures were spreading, and the resistance was growing stronger. But for the first time they felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just fixing the web. They were fighting for its survival and their own. The faint hum of the web echoed softly as Mia, Tessa, and Carter emerged from the cavern that held the nexus. Though their bodies were battered and their nerves frayed, a tenuous sense of accomplishment hung in the air. The artifact in Mia's hands glowed faintly, its warmth a small but reassuring sign that their work had not been in vain. "We stabilized the nexus," Tessa said, her voice steady but cautious. "But it feels like the web is still unraveling. It's quieter now, but it's not fixed." Mia nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. The nexus was a critical point, but it's not the only one. There are still fractures spreading across the web. The artifact's energy. It's telling me where to go next. The pull is stronger now. Carter sighed heavily, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim tunnel ahead of them. "Let me guess. The next one's going to be even worse, isn't it?" Mia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the artifact over in her hands, feeling the rhythmic pulse of its energy. "It's not just worse," she said finally. "It's central. The artifact is pulling us toward the heart of the web. If we don't stabilize it, everything will collapse." "And by everything," Carter said, his voice edged with sarcasm, "you mean our world, their world, and probably all the other worlds, right?" Mia nodded grimly. "Yes." Tessa placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, her expression resolute. "Then we don't stop now. If this is the heart of the web, It might be our only chance to end this. Mia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the artifact. It's going to be dangerous, she warned. The energy at the web center. It's unstable. And we'll face more resistance. The things that came through the fractures, they're drawn to the web's energy. And they'll do everything they can to stop us. Of course they will, Carter muttered. Why wouldn't they? Let's just get this over with. The group pressed on, following the subtle pull of the artifact. The tunnel grew narrower and darker as they descended, the air thick with a cold metallic tang. The faint glow of the crystals that had lined the previous tunnels was absent here, leaving only the dim light of their lanterns to guide them. As they walked, the hum of the web grew louder, vibrating through the walls and the floor beneath their feet. The energy in the air was palpable, a constant, heavy pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The artifact's glow intensified, its patterns shifting more rapidly as though anticipating the challenges ahead. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a cavern larger than any they had encountered before. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into darkness, and the walls were lined with jagged fissures that glowed with a sickly, pulsating light. At the center of the cavern was a massive structure, far larger and more intricate than the nexus they had stabilized. Its surface was alive with shifting patterns of light, and the energy radiating from it was overwhelming. "This is it," Mia said softly, her voice trembling with awe and fear. The heart of the web. The structure pulsed rhythmically, its energy rippling outward in waves that resonated through the cavern. The air was thick with whispers, louder and more chaotic than ever. They overlapped and echoed, creating a cacophony that made it impossible to focus. "What's the plan?" Tessa asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Mia knelt in front of the structure, placing the artifact carefully at its base. "We need to align the artifact's energy with the patterns on the structure," she explained. "But this time it's more than just alignment. The web's heart is damaged. We'll need to channel all of the artifact's energy into stabilizing it." Carter frowned, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the cavern. "And what happens if the artifact doesn't have enough energy?" Mia hesitated, her hands trembling as she traced the patterns on the artifact. "Then the web collapses," she said quietly. "And we won't survive." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Tessa and Carter exchanged a glance, their determination unwavering despite the fear in their eyes. "Then we make sure it works," Tessa said firmly. She knelt beside Mia, her hands steady as she prepared to assist. "Tell us what to do." Mia nodded, her confidence bolstered by their resolve. "We need to redirect the energy from the fissures into the artifact," she said. "The crystals around the cavern are connected to the web. If we can position the lanterns to reflect their light into the fissures, it should create a feedback loop that amplifies the artifact's power." Carter groaned but moved to examine the nearest crystal formation. "Why is it always the crystals?" he muttered under his breath. "Can't we just flip a switch for once?" The group worked quickly, positioning their lanterns and angling the beams of light toward the crystals. As the light struck the formations, the energy within them flared to life, creating a network of glowing lines that spread across the cavern walls. The fissures pulsed in response, their light intensifying as the energy began to flow into the artifact. "It's working," Mia said, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "The artifact is charging." But as the energy surged through the cavern, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, and the shadows at the edges of the cavern began to shift. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deep, guttural roar echoed through the space. "They're coming," Tessa said, her voice tense. She grabbed her lantern, ready to use it as a weapon. "Get ready." The shadows coalesced into dark, sinuous forms, their glowing eyes filled with malice. The creatures moved with terrifying speed, surging toward the group with a hunger that seemed insatiable. The air around them grew colder still, and the hum of the web became a deafening roar. Carter swung his flashlight toward the nearest creature, the beam of light striking its form and causing it to dissolve into smoke. "Keep them back," he shouted. Mia, hurry up. Mia focused on the artifact, her hands trembling as she aligned its patterns with those on the structure. The energy coursing through it was overwhelming, a chaotic storm that threatened to consume her. Almost there, she called out, her voice strained. Tessa and Carter fought to hold back the creatures, their beams of light flashing across the cavern in desperate arcs. The creatures hissed and writhed, retreating from the light but returning with renewed ferocity. With a final surge of effort, Mia aligned the last pattern. The artifact flared with blinding light, and a wave of energy erupted from the structure, consuming the creatures and spreading outward in a brilliant ripple. The cavern trembled violently, and the fissures began to close, their light fading as the web stabilized. When the light subsided, the cavern was silent. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, and the artifact in Mia's hands was warm and steady. The patterns on its surface glowed faintly, a sign that the web's heart had been mended. "We did it," Mia said softly, her voice filled with relief and exhaustion. Tessa and Carter collapsed beside her, their faces pale but triumphant. "Is it over?" Carter asked, his voice shaky. Mia nodded slowly. "Now. The heart is stable, but there are still fractures out there. We have to keep going." Tessa placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, her expression resolute. "We will," she said, one step at a time. The group sat in silence, gathering their strength for the journey ahead. The web was healing, but the fight was far from over. They had stabilized the heart, but the echoes of its damage lingered. The fractures would not stop spreading unless they acted. They had saved the web's heart. Now they had to save its soul. The web was still fragile, its stability tenuous at best. The faint hum that reverberated through the cavern had quieted after they mended the nexus at the heart of the web. But Mia, Tessa, and Carter knew their work was far from over. The artifact in Mia's hands was warm and steady, its faint glow a reminder that it was their guide, and their lifeline. "We've stabilized the heart of the web," Tessa said, leaning against the jagged wall of the tunnel as they rested briefly. Her voice was steady, though exhaustion was etched into every line of her face. "But Mia's right. There are still fractures out there. We can't stop now." Carter groaned, rubbing his temples as he sat slumped on a rock. "We've been running around fixing cracks in reality for what feels like forever. How much longer can we keep this up?" "As long as it takes," Mia said firmly. Despite her own exhaustion, there was a determination in her voice that refused to waver. She studied the artifact, her fingers brushing against its intricate patterns as she felt for the faint pull that would guide them to the next fracture. "The web's stabilizing, but there are still weak points. If we don't mend them, everything we've done so far will be for nothing." Tessa nodded, standing and brushing the dust from her clothes. "Then let's move. We can rest when this is over." Mia felt the pull of the artifact strengthen, a subtle but unmistakable tug that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. "This way," she said, motioning toward a tunnel that branched off into the darkness. The others followed without hesitation, their lanterns casting long shadows on the jagged walls. The tunnel was narrower than the ones they had traversed before, the air colder and heavier. The faint crystalline glow that had illuminated the previous passages was absent here, leaving only the dim light of their lanterns to guide them. The whispers that had haunted them earlier had returned, faint but persistent, their overlapping voices creating an uneasy backdrop to their journey. "Does it feel different to you?" Carter asked, breaking the tense silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he feared the cavern itself might be listening. Tessa nodded, her hand resting on the compass at her side. The needle spun erratically, unable to settle on a fixed point. "It's like the air is heavier," she said. "And colder." Mia's grip on the artifact tightened. "We're getting closer to another fracture," she said softly. "I can feel it. The energy. It's more unstable here." The tunnel began to widen, the jagged walls giving way to a larger, open space. The faint glow of fissures along the cavern floor and walls provided an eerie, flickering light. At the center of the room stood a structure similar to the ones they had encountered before, though it was smaller and less ornate. Its surface was cracked and dark, pulsing faintly as though struggling to maintain its connection to the web. "This is the next node," Mia said, her voice steady despite the unease that prickled at the edges of her consciousness. She approached the structure cautiously, the artifact in her hands beginning to pulse in response. "Same process as before?" Tessa asked, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The whispers were louder here, echoing off the walls in a way that made it difficult to tell where they were coming from. Mia nodded. "We need to align the artifact with the node's energy patterns and redirect the flow into the crystals. But this node, it feels weaker than the others. More damaged." "Damaged how?" Carter asked, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the room. "The energy is fragmented," Mia explained, her brow furrowed as she studied the patterns on the artifact. "It's not flowing smoothly. If we don't stabilize it, the fracture will spread." "Then let's get to it," Tessa said, her tone firm. "Carter, help me position the lanterns. Mia, do what you need to do." The group moved quickly, each of them falling into their roles with practiced efficiency. Tessa and Carter adjusted the lanterns, angling their beams toward the crystals embedded in the cavern walls. The light refracted across the room, creating a network of glowing lines that pulsed faintly in time with the node. Mia knelt before the structure, placing the artifact in a shallow depression at its base. The moment it made contact, the patterns on its surface flared to life, their light merging with the faint glow of the node. The hum of the web grew louder, resonating through the cavern like a heartbeat. "It's responding," Mia said, her voice filled with both relief and apprehension. "The connection is forming." But as the energy began to flow through the crystals, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them trembled. From the shadows at the edges of the cavern, dark, sinuous shapes began to emerge. "Not again," Carter muttered, his grip tightening on his flashlight as the shadowy creatures moved closer. Their glowing eyes burned with malice, and the air around them seemed to distort, growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. "Keep them back," Tessa shouted, swinging her lantern toward the nearest creature. The beam of light struck its form, causing it to writhe and dissolve into smoke. "Mia, focus on the node. We'll handle these things." Mia nodded, her hands trembling as she concentrated on aligning the artifact's patterns with those of the node. The energy coursing through the room was chaotic, surging and ebbing unpredictably. She could feel the strain on the artifact, its warmth intensifying as it struggled to stabilize the flow. Tessa and Carter fought to hold back the creatures, their beams of light flashing across the room in frantic arcs. The creatures hissed and recoiled, but their numbers were growing, and their movements were more coordinated than before. "They're learning," Carter shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "They're adapting to the light. Then keep them off us as long as you can." Tessa yelled back, swinging her lantern in a wide arc to drive the creatures back. "Mia, we need more time." "I'm trying," Mia called out, her voice strained. The artifact flared with light, and the patterns on the node began to stabilize. The energy in the room surged, the glowing lines connecting the crystals intensifying as the web's flow was redirected. The creatures let out a deafening roar, their forms writhing as the light from the crystals grew brighter. One by one, they dissolved into smoke, their resistance finally overcome by the stabilizing energy of the node. The cavern fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting as the node's glow steadied. Mia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the artifact dimmed in her hands. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Tessa and Carter joined her, their faces pale but triumphant. "How many more of these things are we going to have to fix?" Carter asked, his voice weary. Mia looked up, her eyes filled with both determination and exhaustion. "As many as it takes," she said softly. "We're reweaving the web, one thread at a time." Tessa placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression resolute. "Then let's keep moving. We're not finished yet." The group gathered their belongings and prepared to move on, the faint hum of the web echoing around them as they stepped back into the darkness. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. The fractures would not stop spreading unless they acted. And they would not stop until the web was whole again. The tunnel they entered after stabilizing the latest node felt endless, twisting and turning with no discernible pattern. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, the oppressive weight of the fractured web pressing down on Mia, Tessa, and Carter like a suffocating shroud. The artifact in Mia's hands pulsed faintly, its warmth their only guide as they ventured deeper into the unknown. "We've stabilized 2 fractures and the nexus," Tessa said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. She glanced at Mia, her expression hard but determined. "How much farther do we have to go?" Mia hesitated, the weight of the question reflected in her furrowed brow. "I don't know," she admitted. The patterns on the artifact shifted erratically, as though mirroring the chaos of the unraveling web. "The artifact is still pulling us forward. There must be more fractures ahead." Carter let out a frustrated groan, his flashlight beam flickering as he swung it across the jagged walls. "More fractures? How many more? At this rate, we'll be patching holes in reality until the end of time." "It's not just about patching holes," Mia said sharply, her tone tinged with both urgency and exhaustion. She stopped walking, turning to face him. "The web isn't just breaking, it's collapsing. Every fracture we stabilize is buying us time, but if we don't find a way to stop the collapse entirely, it won't matter how many we fix." "And how do we stop a collapse like this?" Carter demanded, his voice rising. "Because it sure feels like we're in over our heads." "We are," Tessa interjected, her tone calm but firm. "But we don't have a choice. If we give up now, everything ends." Carter opened his mouth to argue but thought better of it. Instead, he sighed heavily and gestured for Mia to lead the way. "Fine. Let's keep going. Not like we have anywhere else to be." Mia nodded, her fingers tightening around the artifact as she resumed walking. The faint pull of its energy guided them deeper into the tunnel, the rhythmic hum of the web growing louder with each step. The air grew colder still, and a faint mist began to seep from the cracks in the walls, coiling around their feet like living tendrils. As they descended, the tunnel opened into another cavern, larger than the last, its walls lined with glowing fissures that pulsed erratically. The air here was thick with energy, and the hum of the web was deafening, vibrating through their very bones. At the center of the cavern stood another node, its structure cracked and dark, radiating an aura of instability. "This one's worse than the last," Mia said, her voice barely audible over the noise. She knelt in front of the node, placing the artifact in a shallow depression at its base. The patterns on its surface flickered faintly, struggling to align with the shifting designs on the node. Tessa and Carter stood guard, their lanterns and flashlights cutting through the mist that filled the cavern. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and writhing like living things. "We've got company," Tessa said, her voice tense. She raised her lantern, its beam slicing through the mist to reveal dark, sinuous shapes emerging from the fissures in the walls. The creatures' glowing eyes burned with malevolence, and the air around them grew colder as they advanced. "Great," Carter muttered, gripping his flashlight tightly. Because fixing reality wasn't hard enough without having to fight off shadow monsters. "Keep them back," Mia shouted, her voice strained as she focused on the artifact. The energy surging through it was chaotic, the patterns on its surface shifting erratically as it struggled to stabilize the node. "I need more time." Tessa and Carter moved to intercept the creatures, their beams of light flashing across the cavern. The shadows recoiled from the light, their forms writhing and dissolving into smoke, but they quickly reformed, their movements more coordinated than before. "They're learning again," Tessa said, her voice tight with frustration. She swung her lantern in a wide arc, driving the creatures back. "Mia, how much longer?" "Almost there," Mia called out, her hands trembling as she aligned the artifact's patterns with those on the node. The energy surged through the room, the glowing fissures intensifying as the web's flow was redirected. The creatures hissed and shrieked, their forms writhing violently as the light from the crystals grew brighter. But instead of retreating, they surged forward, their glowing eyes fixed on the artifact. "They're going for the artifact," Carter shouted, his flashlight beam slashing through the air. "Tessa, help me hold them off." The two of them formed a protective barrier around Mia, their beams of light flashing in frantic arcs to keep the creatures at bay. The shadows hissed and recoiled, but their numbers were growing, and their movements were becoming more aggressive. Mia focused all her attention on the artifact, her mind racing as she tried to stabilize the node. The patterns on its surface flared brightly, the energy surging through the room in chaotic waves. "Just a little more," she shouted, her voice trembling with effort. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and several of the crystals shattered, sending shards of light scattering through the air. The node pulsed erratically, its glow flickering as the artifact struggled to maintain the connection. "We're losing it," Tessa shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "Mia, now would be a good time to finish this." With a final surge of effort, Mia aligned the last pattern. The artifact flared with blinding light, and a wave of energy erupted from the node, consuming the creatures and spreading outward in a brilliant ripple. The cavern fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the node's glow steadied. Mia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the artifact dimmed in her hands. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. Tessa and Carter joined her, their faces pale but triumphant. "That was too close," Carter muttered, leaning heavily against a nearby rock. "Way too close." Mia nodded weakly, her exhaustion evident. "The web is stabilizing," she said. "But the fractures, they're getting harder to fix. The closer we get to the core, the more unstable everything becomes." Tessa placed a hand on her shoulder, her expression resolute. "Then we don't stop," she said firmly. "We keep going until it's done." Carter groaned but nodded, his eyes filled with reluctant determination. Yeah. Save reality, fight monsters, try not to die. Just another day in the office." Mia managed a faint smile, her hands clutching the artifact tightly. "Thank you," she said softly. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, gathering their strength. The path ahead was uncertain, and the challenges they faced were growing more daunting with each step. But they knew one thing for sure: the fractures would not stop spreading unless they acted. And they would not stop until the web was whole again. The cavern settled into an eerie quiet after the latest fracture was sealed. Mia, Tessa, and Carter rested on the cold, jagged floor, their breaths heavy and labored. The artifact in Mia's hands glowed faintly, its light steady but dim, a stark contrast to the chaotic surges it had endured moments before. "How many more of these can we handle?" Carter muttered, his voice carrying the weariness of their relentless battle. He leaned back against the wall, his flashlight flickering weakly in his hand. "Because I'm pretty sure I'm running on fumes." "We'll handle as many as we need to," Tessa said firmly, though the exhaustion in her voice betrayed her own doubts. She turned to Mia, who was still staring at the artifact with a furrowed brow. "Mia, where's it pulling us now?" Mia hesitated, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on the artifact's surface. She felt the subtle tug in her chest, the now familiar pull of the web guiding them toward the next fracture. But this time it was different. The pull wasn't faint or distant. It was strong, almost overwhelming, as if the web itself was demanding their attention. "It's close," she said finally, her voice trembling. "The next fracture, it's not far from here." But what?" Tessa pressed, her eyes narrowing. Mia looked up, her face pale. "It feels different, bigger, like it's more than just a fracture. Central. Carter repeated, sitting up straighter. "You mean like the heart of the web?" Mia shook her head. "Whoa. We've already stabilized the heart. This feels deeper, like it's connected to the web's very foundation. If we don't fix it..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The gravity of her words settled over the group like a heavy shroud. Tessa stood, brushing the dust from her clothes. "Then we go," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "Whatever's waiting for us, we face it head-on." Carter groaned but pushed himself to his feet. "Great. More shadow monsters and reality-bending nightmares. Just what I wanted." Mia managed a faint smile despite the tension. "Thank you," she said softly. The three of them set off, following the artifact's pull through another twisting tunnel. The air grew colder as they descended, the faint glow of the crystals along the walls flickering like dying embers. The rhythmic hum of the web grew louder, vibrating through the stone around them, and the whispers returned, softer than before but no less unsettling. "Do you hear that?" Tessa asked, her voice low. She glanced over her shoulder, her hand resting on the compass at her side. Mia nodded. "The web is speaking," she said hesitantly. "Or maybe it's the fractures. I don't know. But it feels like something is trying to communicate with us." "Communicate?" Carter asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What, like the web's alive or something?" "Not alive," Mia replied, her brow furrowing in thought. "But it's more than just energy. It's connected. Every thread, every node. It's all part of a greater whole. And when we stabilized the heart, I think we woke something up." "Woke something up," Carter repeated, his voice rising slightly. "That's not exactly comforting, Mia." Tessa shot him a warning glance. "Focus, Carter. Whatever's happening, we'll deal with it." They emerged from the tunnel into a cavern unlike any they had encountered before. The space was vast, its walls lined with jagged crystal formations that pulsed with a sickly, uneven light. The air was thick with tension, and the hum of the web was deafening here, a constant vibration that seemed to resonate through their very bones. At the center of the cavern stood a massive structure, far larger and more intricate than any node they had seen before. Its surface was alive with shifting patterns of light, and the energy radiating from it was almost overwhelming. The artifact in Mia's hands flared brightly in response, its patterns aligning with those on the structure. "This is it," Mia said softly, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "This is the source of the fractures." The structure pulsed, and the air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves on a summer's day. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single resonant voice that filled the cavern. "You should not be here." The voice was deep and resonant, carrying a weight that made it feel as though the cavern itself was speaking. Tessa and Carter froze, their eyes darting around the room. "Did you hear that?" Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, her heart pounding. "It's coming from the web." "The web is not yours to mend," the voice continued, its tone filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You do not understand what you are unweaving." Tessa stepped forward, her jaw set. "We're trying to save it," she said firmly. "If we don't stabilize the fractures, everything will collapse." "The collapse is inevitable," the voice replied. "It has already begun. You delay what must come to pass." Mia shook her head, clutching the artifact tightly. "That's not true," she said, her voice filled with determination. "The web can be saved. We've already stabilized the heart. We can fix this." The cavern trembled, and the shimmering distortion around the structure grew stronger. "You are blind to the truth," the voice said. "The web's unraveling is not a mistake. It is a release. You seek to bind what was never meant to be whole." "What does that mean?" Tessa demanded, her voice rising. "Who are you?" The voice did not answer directly. Instead, the air around the structure rippled, and a massive, shadowy form began to emerge. Its shape was indistinct, shifting constantly as though it could not decide on a single form. Its glowing eyes burned with a piercing intensity, and the energy radiating from it was suffocating. "You're the one causing this," Mia said, her voice trembling. "You're the reason the web is collapsing." The shadowy form shifted, its glowing eyes locking onto Mia. "I am not the cause," it said. "I am the consequence." The web was flawed from the beginning, a prison masquerading as a connection. You seek to preserve it, but you do not understand the cost. Mia hesitated, her mind racing. The words of the voice resonated with an unsettling truth, but she couldn't abandon their mission. Even if it's flawed, it's all we have, she said. If we let it collapse, everything ends. The shadow surged forward, its form expanding to fill the cavern. Then you will face the cost of your defiance, it said, its voice echoing with finality. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and the crystals lining the walls shattered, sending shards of light scattering through the air. The artifact in Mia's hands flared brightly, its patterns shifting erratically as it struggled to stabilize the energy surging through the room. Mia, what do we do? Tessa shouted, her voice barely audible over the noise. Mia closed her eyes, focusing on the artifact. We stabilize the source, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. No matter what. The group moved quickly, falling into their familiar roles. Tessa and Carter positioned their lanterns, angling the beams toward the crystals that remained intact. The light refracted across the room, creating a network of glowing lines that pulsed in time with the artifact. The shadowy form roared, its presence growing more oppressive as it lashed out at the light. The beams wavered but held, their energy creating a barrier that pushed the shadow back. Mia, hurry! Carter shouted, swinging his flashlight toward the creature. With a final surge of effort, Mia aligned the artifact's patterns with those on the structure. The energy coursing through the room reached a crescendo, and the artifact flared with blinding light. The shadow let out a deafening roar as the light consumed it, and the cavern trembled violently. When the light subsided, the shadow was gone, and the structure pulsed with a steady, calming glow. The artifact in Mia's hands dimmed, its patterns stable once more. We did it, Mia said softly, her voice trembling with relief. Tessa and Carter joined her, their faces pale but triumphant. For now, Tessa said, her tone cautious. But we still don't know the full truth about what we're dealing with. Mia nodded, her exhaustion evident. The web is stabilizing, but the voice, it's still out there. And it won't stop until it gets what it wants. The group sat in silence, gathering their strength. The battle was far from over, but for the first time they felt a glimmer of hope. The web could be saved, but only if they uncovered the truth hidden within its threads. The silence after the blinding light faded was overwhelming. Mia, Tessa, and Carter sat in the aftermath of the battle, their breaths labored and their bodies aching. The cavern was still, the shattered crystals on the walls now dim and lifeless. The structure at the center, which had been unstable and chaotic moments ago, pulsed softly with a steady rhythm. The artifact in Mia's hands mirrored this pulse, glowing faintly but unwavering. This is bigger than we thought, Tessa said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady but tinged with unease. She turned to Mia, her expression unreadable. That thing, whatever it wasn't just another creature from the fractures. No, Mia agreed softly, her fingers tightening around the artifact. It's part of the web. Or maybe it's something the web was keeping contained. Carter groaned, sitting down heavily on a nearby rock. So now we're not just patching up reality, we're also dealing with ancient cosmic jailers. Great. Just great. Mia ignored his sarcasm, her focus on the artifact. Its patterns had shifted subtly, new symbols emerging that she hadn't seen before. They seemed familiar, yet alien, like echoes of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. The web is more than we understood, she said, her voice distant as she traced the symbols. It's not just a network of connections. It's alive in a way. And it's old. Older than anything we can comprehend. Tessa frowned, stepping closer to look at the artifact. How do you know that? Mia hesitated, her mind racing. The artifact, it's not just a tool. A piece of the web itself. Every time we stabilize a fracture, I feel it more strongly. The web isn't just energy, it has memory, purpose. And I think the fractures aren't accidents. Carter raised an eyebrow. Not accidents. You think someone's doing this on purpose? Mia shook her head. Not someone. Something. The voice we heard, the shadow, it said the web wasn't meant to stay whole. That the collapse is inevitable. Tessa crossed her arms, her expression hard. That's not good enough. If this collapse is inevitable, then why are we able to stabilize the fractures? Why does the artifact even exist? Mia looked up, meeting Tessa's gaze. Maybe because the web is trying to survive, she said softly. Or maybe it's trying to give us a choice. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The group fell silent, the faint hum of the web filling the cavern like a heartbeat. Finally Tessa spoke. If the web is alive, then it's not just a network, it's a system. Systems can be manipulated, but they can also be understood. If we figure out what the web's purpose is, we'll know whether we're supposed to fix it, or let it collapse. And how do we do that? Carter asked, his voice tinged with frustration. It's not like the web's going to give us a user manual. Mia stared at the artifact, her mind working furiously. The new patterns on its surface seemed to form a map of sorts, faint lines connecting glowing points that pulsed rhythmically. The artifact, she said. It's changing. These symbols, they're guiding us somewhere. Maybe to another node or something else. Tessa stepped closer, studying the patterns. If it's a map, then we follow it, she said decisively. Wherever it leads, we'll find answers. Carter sighed, standing and brushing off his pants. Fine. But if the answers involve more shadow monsters, I'm calling it quits. Mia managed a faint smile, though her expression remained serious. It might, she said honestly. But if we don't follow this, the web will keep collapsing, and there won't be anything left to save. With the artifact pulsing faintly in her hands, Mia led the way through another tunnel that branched off from the cavern. The air grew colder as they descended, the rhythmic hum of the web growing louder with each step. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and dark, devoid of the crystals and fissures they had encountered before. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an almost tangible energy. Do you feel that? Tessa asked, her voice low. She glanced around, her hand resting on the compass at her side. The needle, which had been erratic before, was now spinning wildly. Mia nodded, her grip tightening on the artifact. We're getting closer to something, she said. I don't know what, but it's important. Carter grunted, his flashlight beam sweeping across the walls. Important doesn't always mean good. The tunnel opened into another cavern, but this one was unlike any they had seen before. The space was vast, its walls lined with intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The carvings depicted scenes of interconnected threads, vast networks of light and energy spanning across endless expanses. At the center of the cavern stood a massive structure, its surface covered in shifting symbols that mirrored those on the artifact. Mia froze, her eyes wide as she took in the sight. This is it, she whispered. This is the web's origin. Tessa and Carter stepped forward, their eyes scanning the carvings. The scenes were mesmerizing, depicting worlds connected by shimmering threads of light, their inhabitants thriving in harmony. But as they moved closer, the carvings changed, showing fractures appearing in the threads, worlds unraveling, and shadowy figures emerging from the chaos. This isn't just a network, Tessa said, her voice filled with awe. It's the history. The web was holding these worlds together. And now it's breaking, Carter said grimly. He pointed to a carving that showed a massive, shadowy figure severing the threads with its jagged claws. That thing, it's the reason the web is falling apart. Mia shook her head. Whoa. It's not the cause. It's a consequence. The web was flawed from the beginning. The energy needed to sustain it was too great. Over time, the threads weakened, and the fractures started forming. The shadows. They're what happens when the web's energy becomes unstable. Tessa frowned, studying the carvings. Then why are we stabilizing the fractures? If the web was always going to collapse, what's the point? To give us time, Mia said softly. She looked down at the artifact, its patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. The web is alive, but it's dying. It knows it can't hold itself together forever. By stabilizing the fractures, we're giving it a chance to show us its truth. The truth about what? Carter asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Mia hesitated, her gaze fixed on the massive structure at the center of the cavern. About what comes next, she said finally. The web isn't just holding these worlds together, it's preparing them for something bigger. The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy shroud. The artifact pulsed faintly, its glow casting long shadows across the cavern floor. We need to stabilize this node, Mia said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. It's the key to understanding the web's purpose. If we don't, we'll never know the truth. Tessa nodded, her expression resolute. Then let's get to work. The group moved quickly, their actions practiced and efficient. As Mia placed the artifact on the structure, its patterns flared brightly, and the carvings on the walls began to glow more intensely. The hum of the web grew louder, resonating through the cavern like a heartbeat. But as the energy surged, the shadows returned. The air grew colder, and the cavern trembled as dark, sinuous forms emerged from the walls, their glowing eyes fixed on the artifact. Not again, Carter muttered, raising his flashlight. Why can't these things just leave us alone? Because they're part of this, Mia said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The web is trying to protect itself, and so are they. Tessa swung her lantern toward the nearest shadow, driving it back with a beam of light. Mia, focus on the node, she shouted. We'll hold them off. Mia nodded, her hands trembling as she concentrated on aligning the artifact's patterns with those on the structure. The energy surged around her, chaotic and overwhelming, but she refused to give in. This node wasn't just another fracture. It was the key to unlocking the web's ultimate truth. As the shadows closed in, the carvings on the walls flared with blinding light, and the artifact's patterns aligned perfectly with the structure. The energy reached a crescendo, consuming the cavern in a wave of brilliance. When the light subsided, the shadows were gone, and the cavern was still. The artifact in Mia's hands was warm and steady, its patterns glowing faintly but with a new, profound clarity. We're closer now, Mia said softly, her voice trembling with exhaustion. But the truth? It's still out there. And it's waiting for us. The cavern fell silent after the blinding light subsided, its oppressive energy replaced by a heavy stillness. The massive structure at the center pulsed gently, its glow steady and calm, as though it had been relieved of a great burden. The carvings on the walls, now glowing faintly, depicted interconnected worlds and fractured threads rejoining into a semblance of unity. Mia sat on the cold ground, clutching the artifact tightly as it radiated a steady warmth. Its patterns had shifted again, forming intricate, interconnected symbols that seemed alive, their light pulsing in sync with the structure. We stabilized another key point, Tessa said, breaking the silence. She leaned against a nearby rock, her face pale but resolute. But something about this one felt different, like it wasn't just a node. Mia nodded, her gaze fixed on the artifact. It wasn't. This was more than a node, it was a core. Not the heart of the web, but something close to it. It's feeding the rest of the web's connections. And the shadows? Carter asked, his voice low. He sat with his back to the wall, his flashlight resting beside him. Are they gone? Or are they going to come back the moment we move? They're part of the web, Mia said softly. They always have been. The fractures, the collapse, it's all tied to them. They're the byproduct of the web's instability. When we stabilize these points, we're not just fixing the web. We're driving them back into the cracks. But they keep coming, Tessa said, her tone sharp. And if this collapse was inevitable, like the voice said, then stabilizing these points might not be enough. We need to understand what's causing this. Mia stood slowly, the artifact glowing faintly in her hands. We're close to the answer, she said, her voice trembling with both determination and fear. The artifact. It's changing. The patterns are clearer now. It's guiding us to something final. Carter let out a humorless laugh. Final. Great. Because everything else has been such a walk in the park. Tessa shot him a sharp look but said nothing. She turned to Mia, her expression serious. What do you mean by something final? Mia hesitated, her eyes locked on the artifact. The artifact isn't just a tool for stabilizing the web, she said slowly. Key. It's been guiding us to each fracture, each node, but it's also collecting information. About the web, about its origins, about what's coming. What's coming? Tessa pressed, her voice steady but tense. I don't know, Mia admitted. But the artifact does. And it's taking us to the place where we'll find out. The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy shroud. For a moment no one spoke. The faint hum of the web filled the cavern, its rhythmic pulse a constant reminder of the fragility of their reality. Finally Tessa stood, brushing the dust from her clothes. Then we keep moving, she said firmly. If the artifact is guiding us to answers, we follow it. Whatever's waiting for us, we face it together. Carter groaned but pushed himself to his feet. Of course we do, he muttered. Because running headfirst into danger has worked out so well for us so far. Despite his sarcasm, there was a determination in his voice that mirrored Tessa's. Mia managed a faint smile, grateful for their resolve. Together they left the cavern, following the subtle pull of the artifact deeper into the tunnels. The air grew colder as they descended, the rhythmic hum of the web growing louder with each step. The walls of the tunnel were smooth and dark, devoid of the crystals and fissures they had encountered before. The atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an almost tangible energy. This doesn't feel right, Carter said, breaking the tense silence. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but endless shadow ahead. It's too quiet. It's not quiet, Mia said softly. She clutched the artifact tightly, her brow furrowed. The web is speaking. Speaking, Tessa repeated, glancing at her. What do you mean? Mia hesitated, searching for the right words. It's like... It's alive, she said finally. Every hum, every pulse, it's communicating. And now... it's trying to show us something. The tunnel opened into a cavern unlike any they had seen before. The space was vast, its walls lined with intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The carvings depicted the same interconnected worlds they had seen before, but here the images were more detailed. The threads of the web were vibrant, alive with energy, and the worlds they connected thrived in harmony. This is beautiful, Tessa said, her voice filled with awe. She stepped closer to the walls, tracing her fingers over the glowing carvings. It's like the web is perfect. It was perfect, Mia said, her tone heavy. But look closer. As they moved deeper into the cavern, the carvings changed. The vibrant threads began to fray, their glow dimming as fractures appeared. The once thriving worlds began to crumble, their inhabitants consumed by darkness. Shadowy figures emerged from the cracks, their jagged forms tearing through the delicate threads. This is the web's history, Mia said, her voice trembling. It was meant to hold everything together, to connect the worlds. But something went wrong. Carter pointed to a section of the carvings that showed a massive, shadowy figure at the center of the web. Its jagged limbs severed the threads, and its glowing eyes burned with malice. That thing, he said. It's the cause of all this. No, Mia said, shaking her head. It's not the cause, it's the consequence. The web's collapse created it. The instability, the fractures. It gave birth to the shadows. Then why does the artifact keep guiding us to stabilize the web? Tessa asked, her voice sharp. If it's collapsing, why not let it fall? Because the collapse isn't just an end, Mia said. She stepped closer to the carvings, her eyes scanning the intricate patterns. It's a transition. The web isn't just breaking, it's evolving. The weight of her words settled over the group, the implications sinking in like lead. The hum of the web grew louder, resonating through the cavern as if echoing Mia's realization. "What does that mean for us?" Carter asked, his voice tinged with fear. "For our world. It means we have a choice," Mia said softly. She held up the artifact, its glow intensifying. "We can stabilize the web, keep it from collapsing completely. Or we can let it fall and see what comes next." Tessa stared at her, her expression unreadable. "And what happens if we let it fall?" "I don't know," Mia admitted. "But the artifact does. And it's taking us to the place where we'll find out." The group stood in silence, the hum of the web filling the air like a heartbeat. The carvings on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the artifact, their glow casting long shadows across the cavern floor. "Then we follow it," Tessa said finally, her voice steady. "Whatever's waiting for us, we'll face it together." The artifact pulsed brightly, its light casting intricate patterns across the walls. The web had revealed its truth, but its ultimate purpose remained shrouded in mystery. As Mia led the group deeper into the tunnels, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was approaching its end, and that the final choice would change everything.